Welcome. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Welcome to everybody who's patiently waiting in the chat. And first of all, I'd like to thank all you brothers and sisters in the chat who have been, like I said, patiently waiting. Even from this morning, I saw comments in the chat. People are very keen to see this discussion, this debate. My name is Muhammad Abu Shuaib from COVFF YouTube channel. I am actually hosting today's discussion. First of all, I'd like to welcome King Servant and give you some brief information for the brothers and sisters who've not come across or not seen King Servant before. King Servant is a born again follower of Jesus and a member of the local church which does evangelistic activity with including street evangelism, otherwise a street dawah, guys. And interesting. He preaches occasionally and has written several articles regarding Islam and Christianity. In addition to engaging in moderated dialogues and debates online, also he can be contacted privately on kingservantapologist@gmail.com. If you guys want his email address, hopefully we can put it in the chat and where you can contact King Servant privately. First of all, let me welcome King Servant. King Servant, welcome to today's show. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here.
Awesome. And of course, fine, excellent. Good to see you, King Servant, to be honest. Normally you have like a guitar in the background. What are we doing to the guitar?
I'm sitting in a slightly different position.
Awesome. Welcome to today's discussion. I really appreciate you. Of course, for you brothers and sisters who do not know Brother Yemeni, let me slightly introduce Brother Yemeni for those who are new to the channel. Of course, Brother Yemeni is a da'i, a researcher, a polemicist, engaging in comparative religion and intra-Islamic discourse. His work prioritizes Aqidah while also extending into specialized disciplines such as Ulum Quran. Hopefully I pronounced that properly. In collaboration with students of knowledge, he produces educational and debate content across multiple platforms, including his YouTube channel, the Yemenite Front, and also he's on TikTok under the same name. In addition to his academic and dawah efforts, he runs Rihatul Arab, which is a fantastic business, brothers and sisters, which he offers authentic Arabian oud and much more. I'll definitely recommend Brother Yemeni's oud selection is fantastic. And currently, actually, this particular week is 20% off. So I definitely recommend you, brother and sister, to check out the website. Of course, private correspondence can be made via contact email listed on his YouTube channel. Apparently, my audio is terrible. I'm getting some reviews in the chat. I do apologize, guys. It was working perfectly fine until we jumped live. Brother Yemeni, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to today's show.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm excited for this discussion, inshallah.
Nice, beautiful. It's really good to see you, brother, to be honest. And I've hosted many debates between you two gentlemen, and I'll be taking more of a back seat on this discussion because these guys are real gentlemen. And even though there'll be fireworks, there'll be punches thrown and jabs and so forth, but it's still going to be a fascinating debate and back and forth. It's not going to be Joshua or Jake Paul. This is going to be a real discussion, a real fight. So stay tuned, guys. It's going to be very interesting. Let me just briefly give you the format of today's show. Each speaker, and starting will be the Muslim speaker, Brother Yemeni. He'll have 30 minutes opening presentation. Then he'll have 10 minutes of one rebuttal. Then the second part will be 7 minutes, 2 rebuttals. So it'll be 7 minutes and there'll be 2 rebuttals from each side. Then there'll be a 10-minute cross-examination times 2, which is going to be quite interesting. Let me just warn you now, brothers and sisters. And the reason I'm warning you, because we want to keep the discussion in the chat polite and respectful. The back and forth, the 10-minute cross-examination will get heated. And unfortunately, I might have to step in just to calm it down a bit. And of course, we've got the last 5 minutes in conclusions. And again, each speaker will have 5 minutes to conclude their discussion. Then it will be a beautiful opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So my advice is to get your questions nice and early. I would definitely say just after the 10-minute presentation from each side. We will be only taking written questions. So when you write a question in the private chat, please write who is it for, okay? Who you're addressing the question to. So without any further ado, any more talking or any more monologue for myself, Brother Yemeni, you will be opening your first presentation with 10 minutes. And then, of course, King Servant will have his 10 minutes of his opening presentation. I will actually drop down now. And then as soon as you start speaking from your presentation, I will start the 10 minutes. And of course, you are also fully in your rights to have a timer for yourself to time it, and also King Servant. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much, brothers and sisters. Please be patient and really take note of today's discussion. The title is, was Muhammad, peace be upon him, a true prophet of God? Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Okay. Well, before Brother Shoaib starts my timer, I just want to mention to everyone that this is, even though this is a debate, I want people to bear in mind that me and Daniel, we have a history, a very good history. So despite how heated it may get, it's not out of maliciousness or hatred. Rather, it is due to the passion of the subject. So I want to mention that, inshallah. And of course, what we're about to debate can have many things that can be debated on separately, but we'll try and keep things concise. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen. And if that's all good, Brother Shoaib, I'm going, if you can start my time when I start speaking, inshallah. Yalla, bismillah. Okay, so today's debate, is the Prophet ﷺ a true prophet? Well, my approach today is going to address these four things. The historical method, because at the end of the day, this is a historical question. And we need to understand that any evidence that we bring forth is based on historical certainty as opposed to historical ambiguity. The prophetic criteria in Islam, the accusations against the Prophet, peace be upon him, as to how he came to be a prophet. And of course, the falsification tests that Islam presents to falsify him, as well as the Quran. So Islamic sources, to keep this simple, considering ilm al-hadith is a vast ocean of knowledge, we can summarize it in these 6 points. It uses names and chains of transmitters, not hypothetical sources. It evaluates people down to their memory and honesty, not just the texts. It checks continuity, who met whom and when. It allows cross-checking through multiple chains to ensure reliability. And it then grades that reliability clearly, as we know, sound, weak, fabricated, amongst various other classifications. Has clear falsification. In fact, so much so that even one weak link can invalidate a report entirely. Now, what's interesting is that even Orientalists admit to this. Nabia Abbott is an example, and she mentions it seems much more likely that a strict process of selection rather than a wholesale fabrication of the isnads accounts for the bulk of the hadith that has survived in standard collections. Now, why she says bulk is because the Muslims have also preserved their fabricated reports. So this is already known to them. So an early challenge for my opponent, he would have to demonstrate knowledge on the science of hadith used by scholars to prove it is unreliable. Otherwise, it is nothing more than an appeal to authority and common knowledge. So what is the prophetic criteria? In the Quran, we have various, but these are the key ones. He's not self-appointed. He receives revelation, calls to Tawheed, has moral character, does miracles, and of course he prophesies. So let's look at not being self-appointed, because at the end of the day, we're looking at the history. So utilizing the Quran alone is not going to be sufficient. So we need to look at the history, what we know about the Prophet ﷺ. So we're only going to appeal to that which is authentic. And as it mentions in Bukhari 3, the angel came to him and asked him to read. And when the Prophet ﷺ said to him 3 times that I do not know how to read, thereupon the first 5 verses of the Quran were revealed. And calls to monotheism. This was the priority of the message. In fact, the entirety of the Quran, every verse of the Quran is based around Tawheed. And it shows here in this report when the Prophet ﷺ said Mu'ad to Yemen, he said to him, you are going to a nation from the people of the scripture, so let the first thing to which you will invite them be Tawheed of Allah. Now let's look at the moral character. Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, said that the character of the Messenger of Allah was the Quran. Now again, this is all well and good that his wife has said this, but what is the evidence that his character was indeed that of the Quran? So let's look at some historical examples. Forgiveness. He forgave the Jewess who poisoned him and anyone unless they transgressed religious law. In terms of respect, he was asking a young boy for permission to give drink to elders when it was the young boy's turn. Now, this usually doesn't happen even amongst our society. Good conduct with others. He never chastised a servant, even to the point of saying "uff" over his 10 years of servitude. Cheerfulness, meeting people with a smile. This was the nature of the Prophet ﷺ, very always smiling with the people that he met. Bravery. He was on the front lines of Badr, even ahead of the companions. So this is not a prophet that was shying in the back ranks and commanding what's going on the battlefield. He was leading the battle. In terms of generosity, he gave a whole flock of sheep and goats to a single man. Mercy. He criticized a camel owner for mistreating it. And even in this hadith, he actually shows a miracle as well. In terms of cooperation, he worked hard alongside his companions. Again, he wasn't this overlord that commanded his companions what to do because he is a prophet. No, he worked hard alongside them, even to the point that there was dust on his abdomen. Wisdom. He chose gentle advice over anger when there was an ignorant mistake from a man. Chivalry. His wife Khadija radiallahu anha was consoling him after the event in the cave by reminding him of his chivalrous deeds that he did to the people prior to his prophethood. Contentment. The Prophet ﷺ was extremely content despite having little food for months and sleeping on a mat that left marks on his body. In terms of his humor, his jokes, even his jokes were without lies, and he enjoyed others' humor and pranks. Cheerful, joke, pranks, all the good stuff there. In terms of poise, he was graceful and dignified. Upholding covenants. He upheld a covenant even at his own disadvantage, because some companions were traveling to help him at the Battle of Badr, but they got held up by Quraysh, and they told him they're not going to fight, and they promised Quraysh, and when the Prophet ﷺ heard of this, he told them not to fight. So this was at his own disadvantage, in order to uphold that covenant that they took personally with Quraysh. In terms of forbearance, patient. He was patient with the harshness of a Bedouin. His honesty. In fact, with this one, his enemies testified to him never telling a lie in these two references that I have cited. In terms of justice, he would apply to justice to one of high status, even his own daughter. He did not discriminate based on wealth or kith and kin. Resolve, discipline, and gratitude. The Prophet ﷺ, he would pray till his feet cracked, thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In terms of love, the Prophet ﷺ expressed love openly to people like the Ansar in the example given. Humility. He blended in with the companions, so much so that when someone came to ask about him, they couldn't distinguish between him and the companions, going to his humble nature, and he helped his family in the home. So that is some of the characters of the Prophet ﷺ, and there is much, much more, but of course, due to time constraints, we can only mention these 15. So let's look at some of the prophecies. Of course, the Roman prophecy. The Romans have been defeated. This happened in 614 AD, in the 4th year of the reign of Heraclius. And then it mentions fi bad'i. Now, fi bid'i, now, in a few years. Now, this word bid'i linguistically refers to between 3 and 9 years. This is a linguistic understanding, not a retroactive explanation. But what we find is that Heraclius had his first triumph against the Persians in 622 AD, putting it at 8 years. In fact, there is a Greek contemporary text that is recorded in the Chronicon of Pasha, which documents the victories of Heraclius starting in the year 622 in the Battle of Issus and the victory over Shahbaraz until the year 628 when he finally retook Jerusalem back from the Persians. So that's a fulfilled prophecy. Abu Lahab. Now, people might be saying, well, what about the fire? You know, we don't know if he's in hellfire. That's not the point here. The point here is that it demonstrates that he will die a non-Muslim. And in fact, this is what happened. He died as a non-Muslim 10 years later. Now, people might say that this is actually, you know, something that is predictable, but because there are many other Muslims who accepted Islam even though being an enemy, you know, but that's exactly the point. That is what happened, and therefore, but it would have been risky to say that he would not accept Islam. The death of his daughter. It was narrated by Aisha that he spoke to Fatima, okay? She was speaking to Fatima, and Fatima anha, spoke to her and said that he informed her that she would be the first of his family to follow. And on that, she laughed. And of course, in Bukhari 3092, Fatima remained alive for 6 months after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, people might say, oh, well, she would lived, but maybe someone else died prior to her from his family. Well, no, that is actually not the case. The Bedouin towers, when the camel herd is complete in tall buildings. Now, I think I need to explain this prophecy, because if you look in Qatar, Dubai, and Saudi, and you think that this is not a prophecy fulfilled, then your sincerity needs to be checked. But as we have seen, the examples of prophecies in the Quran and Sunnah follow a pattern in which they are accurate, specific, unambiguous, and unpredictable. These are criteria to know it is from Allah, given to a true prophet and messenger, and not a false one. So let's talk about miracles now. Many people think that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do miracles. But besides the Quran in of itself, which is a miracle, we have these examples. The moon splitting, witnessed by companions, disbelievers, and travelers. The companions heard a meal glorifying Allah when being eaten by the Prophet, peace be upon him. The Prophet ﷺ multiplied food. The Prophet ﷺ also had water gushing from his hands to fill a vessel for wudu and drinking for the companions. The Prophet ﷺ commanded trees to walk and conceal him when he was relieving himself. And when he finished and the trees finished concealing him, he commanded them to go back to their places. The Prophet ﷺ healed the sick and injured. In the examples given, the Prophet ﷺ would place his hand over his wives and recite a supplication to cure their ailment. And the last example is actually mentioned in the Quran as well. A handful of dust that our Rasul ﷺ took and threw at the enemies. But as it mentions in the Quran, that it wasn't the Prophet ﷺ that threw that, but Allah threw and gave them victory. So these are the miracles. So now let's look at the accusations against the Prophet.
For the Yemeni, that's been over 10 minutes.
Yeah. No problem. Accusations against the Prophet ﷺ. There were 9 accusations against the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the Quran with regards to the origin of the Quran and his motives or the effects of that. They say he was a madman. To you who the reminder is revealed, you must be insane. Well, the response is very simple. No messenger came to the people before them except that they accused him of being a madman or a magician. In fact, there is no evidence of him being mentally unstable. Rather, when you look at the Quran, it doesn't strike you as the ramblings of a madman. A magician. That's another accusation. But they say, the wrongdoers say, you are only following a bewitched man. But hold on a second. Al-Walid bin Mughira, a leading Quraysh authority on Arabic poetry and rhetoric, heard the Quran from the Prophet ﷺ and openly admitted it was unlike poetry, sorcery, or jinn speech, describing it as beautiful, powerful, and unmatched. But under pressure from Abu Jahl and the likes of him, he later dismissed it as magic, after which another prophecy was revealed in the form of chapter 74, verse 11. But he couldn't be a magician or bewitched when it comes to the revelation, because when the Prophet ﷺ was afflicted with magic in Medina, his wife is the one that reports it to us. This was no secret. So this is not an evidence against Islam or against the prophethood of Muhammad ﷺ. Rather, it's an evidence for. There was open transparency with regards to what happened to him. In order to prove that he was a magician, you would have to show that he was either doing magic over 23 years or afflicted by magic over 23 years. And in fact, the Quran mentions that magic is disbelief. And we know the Prophet ﷺ was not a hypocrite. They also accused him of being a poet, right? In fact, they said, a poet for whom we await an ill fate. And the response to that was, say, keep waiting. I too am waiting with you. Now reflect upon this and you will see that this is a powerful response, almost like a challenge. And again, we'll quote what Al-Walid bin Mughira actually said. What can I say? For by Allah, there is not a man among you who knows poetry better than me, or is known more knowledgeable about a poem better than me, or about the poetry of the jinn. By Allah, what he says does not resemble any of that. By Allah, indeed, his speech has sweetness, and indeed upon it is beauty. Its upper part is fruitful, and its lower part is abundant. It rises above all else, and nothing rises above it. That's what he said about the Quran. And in fact, the Quran mentions that you have not taught him poetry, nor is it fitting for him. This is only a reminder and a clear Quran. Why did I mention that verse? Because this is exactly what is mentioned in the history. In fact, it shows that the Prophet ﷺ was the most hateful speech to him, except that he used to recite a verse from the brother of Al-Bashir, and he would make its ending of Qatada, make its ending its beginning, and its beginning its end. And the Prophet and Abu Bakr would tell him it's not like that. And the Prophet ﷺ said, by God, I am not a poet, nor is it appropriate for me. In fact, when poetry was required, he would appoint another a companion to recite poetry as a retortion to the Quraysh instead of doing it himself, because he had no poetic ability. But what is the Quran in of itself? In fact, what is mentioned by Al-Baqalini in his book, Ijaz al-Quran, is that the Quran differs from other forms of speech in this regard, and some claims that this is due to its rhyming phrases or that it occurs unintentionally. However, if such phrases appear in speech, they are not considered rhyme prose, as we have explained regarding a small amount of poetry, such as a single verse, a half verse, or 2 lines of rajaz meter, and similar instances where they occur. These are not considered poetry because they are not intentional. Rather, they occur subtly within the discourse. The same applies to the rhymed prose they claim and attribute to it. It is said to them, if what is in the Quran were, as you claim, rhymed prose, it would be reprehensible and undesirable, because rhymed prose, when its meters vary and its methods differ, becomes ugly in speech. But of course, this is not what the Quran is. So what the scholars, the linguists of, especially in the 3rd and the 4th century, what they say, it resembles rhymed speech prose, but it breaks all its rules. Another accusation, if it is not invented, if he himself did not invent it, it must have been taught. They say the revelations are only ancient fables, and we surely say no one is. They surely say no one is teaching him except a human. But the man they refer to speaks a foreign tongue. So since the Quran is neither poetry nor prose, and the best could not match it, like the likes of Walid bin Mughira, how could it be from a foreigner? But what about the ancient fables? As he mentions, this is the news of the unseen. Neither you nor your people knew it before this. So the Quraysh didn't know this. So what are they accusing him of? In fact, most of the stories in the Quran are Meccan. And while the Prophet ﷺ did travel, and especially settled in Medina, no Jew or Christian actually accused him of this. They never accused him of copying from them or borrowing from them. And even rather, the Jews tested him and affirmed his prophethood. We'll give 2 examples. Abdullah bin Salam tested him on 3 questions, which he said only a prophet would know, and accepted Islam based on that. In fact, a few Jews also tested him on the 10 commandments and even tried to trick him by saying these are 9 commandments. But the Prophet ﷺ caught on to that and mentioned to them the 10 commandments, which are different to the ones that we find in the Bible today. Yet the Jews said to him that we bear witness that you are a prophet, but they did not accept him. And their reason for that is mentioned in the hadith, that if we follow you, then the Jews will kill us. But what my opponent needs to do is to present evidence that shows the Prophet ﷺ sat and learned tales from anyone. Here's the problem: not only would he be able to do so, but he still wouldn't be able to explain how it was formed into the style it is, even if he produced evidence. They also accused him of being a soothsayer, right? But as it is mentioned, the Prophet ﷺ, he hated fortune tellers. In fact, a companion was trying to say, sometimes they tell something which comes out to be true. So, and the response from Allah's Messenger ﷺ was, the word that which comes to be true is what jinn snatches away by stealing, and then pours it in the ear of the foreteller with a sound similar to that of a cackle of a hen, and then they add to it 100 lies. They also accused him of being just a man. But of course, the response is in the Quran, and I don't believe my interlocutor will disagree. We did not send before you except mere men inspired by us. Did not seek wealth and power. They accused him of this. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ was commanded to say, I do not ask you for any reward. And what is the evidence of this? The Messenger of Allah ﷺ was sleeping on a mat, right? And then when he stood up, it left marks on him. Subhanallah. And when he was when he led prayer facing a camel, which was in the booty, and when he had given the salutations, he took a hair from the camel's side and said, I have no right as much as this of your booty, but only to the fifth, and the fifth is returned to you. And this hadith here mentions that the Prophet ﷺ, even when he came into power and wanted the people to swear allegiance to him, he did so with regards to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordered and not to his own whims and desires. And he died humble and generous, so much so that he never left even a dinar or a dirham, nor a male or a female slave. Rather, he only had his mule, his weapons, and a piece of land, which even that he gave in charity. Now, the Quran, in fact, he came to unite a people, right? Another allegation that they levied against him is that he wanted to sow discord. But this religion is of one, and as it's mentioned in the Quran, I am your Lord, so worship me. The believers are but one brotherhood, so make peace between your brothers. And as it mentioned in this verse, and hold firmly together to the rope of Allah and do not be divided. Remember Allah's favor upon you when you were enemies, then he united your hearts, so you by his grace became brothers. So this is the intention of Islam, to cause unity, not division, although religion naturally divides. Now let's look at the falsification test. To produce a surah like it, to find an internal contradiction, as mentioned in chapter 4, verse 82, and to prove corruption, as it has been promised to be preserved by Allah in chapter 15, verse 9. So let's look at producing a surah like it. Now, the Quran, as we have explained, is neither prose nor poetry. In fact, the Quran is its own genre. Okay, it has new grammatical construct that was not used before, new words that yet did not require definition. People understood what they were, what they meant. There was no prior literary training given to the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, and the Quran of itself is exceptionally rich in meaning, yet easy to read and comprehend. When it comes to contradictions, as it's mentioned in this verse, do they not reflect upon the Quran? If it had been from other than Allah, they would have found within it much contradiction. So let's understand this falsification test, because naturally we say that the Quran can be challenged with regards to its consistency and error and contradiction, both internally and externally. But now I'm sitting here saying, no, it's about internal consistency. So let's explain this. The Quran's challenge is about internal consistency, because external claims regarding history, science, philosophy, and etc. depend on changing interpretations and human knowledge, whereas internal contradictions would be objectively demonstrable from the text itself, and would directly falsify its claim of divine authorship, because now there is no faff about how this could be interpreted and whatnot. But let's look at why this is also a serious falsification test, because you could be like, well, there are other texts that are internally consistent, but yeah, we agree, but unlike human written works, the way they become internally consistent is through these four methods: drafts, edits, revisions, and later corrections. But this is not how the Quran came about. The Quran, once it was delivered and completed in terms of its revelation, there was no revisions, there was no retractions after the fact, there was no later harmonizing edits, there was no competing Qurans. And in fact, it remained internally consistent and coherent for over 14 centuries. Now let's look at preserved. What is meant by preservation? This is an important question. As it is mentioned in the hadith, and it's coming from the Prophet ﷺ, each mode of recitation is healing and sufficient. So what the Muslims have understood from the very beginning regarding the preservation of the Quran is that one reading of the Quran is sufficient to call it preserved, because it is Quran. And we don't want people to confuse ahruf and qira'ah to different Qurans. The compilation of the Quran. We have the sources that mention to us that Abu Bakr was the first to collect the Quran, and this happened 7 to 8 months after the demise of the Prophet ﷺ. And in fact, in the end, a couple of decades later, Uthman produced his 4 codices, utilizing the same committee that was utilized by Abu Bakr in order to standardize the Uthmanic rasm of the Quran. So we can summarize it in these 4 points. The initial revelation, the Quran was revealed with a single dialect or harf, and that was the dialect of Quraysh. And more ahruf were revealed until it became 7, which differed in dialect and meaning. But how did the Prophet ﷺ teach it? He taught combinations of the ahruf to different companions, resulting in what we know as the qira'at. And then, of course, as we have mentioned, the masahif came afterwards, and the codices have allowed for the different readings which have been transmitted to us today, and which every Muslim has on his shelf. Now, this is an isnad example, a fraction of it, because this is the isnad of the riwayah of Warsh. Now, what you can see is 7 chains out of 144. Now, we're not saying 144 between the Prophet ﷺ and us. No, this is 144 chains between the Prophet ﷺ and Warsh himself. So you can only imagine how many it is up until this present day. But this is an example highlighting the isnad and how we trace the readings of the Quran and how it is mass transmitted. And each and every one of these are masters in the recitation of the Quran. Well, what about the manuscript tradition? In fact, here we have 5 examples from the 1st century, either from the mid to the late century, containing several folios and decent percentages of the Quran, which all, by the way, conform to the Uthmanic rasm. So what must my opponent do tonight? Now, if he chooses to approach this debate from externally, what he must do is provide evidence that our historical method to establish the history of the Prophet ﷺ and what he did and how the Quran was revealed is unreliable. And he must do that by demonstrating knowledge on hadith literature and hadith science. He must also provide clear evidence that his theology is correct, as opposed to the Jews, to judge the Prophet ﷺ on theological continuity if he chooses to go down that path. He must also provide clear evidence that the Prophet ﷺ doesn't meet the biblical criteria without utilizing double standards within his own criteria. And he must also prove that Jesus came with the final revelation and scripture with no prophet to come that would provide revelation or scripture that conflicts with that which we find in their scriptures. But this is if he chooses to approach it externally. But if he chooses to approach it internally, this is what he must do and what I expect to hear from him in his rebuttals and even in his opening statement. He must disprove the upright character of the Prophet ﷺ. He must provide false prophecies, even one. And we're not talking about unfulfilled prophecies like eschatological prophecies. No, things that are completely false. Disprove his miracles. Prove to me that he didn't do these miracles. Provide evidence of the accusations against him to be true. It doesn't have to be all of them. Could be even one of them. To debunk the linguistic falsification of the challenge. I'm sure he'll have a difficult time with this because it requires extensive knowledge of the Arabic language. But he can also approach it from the internal consistency of the Quran and actually falsify that. Now, of course, he has to ensure that he is going into the context and not just falsifying it from a superficial reading of the Quran. He has to demonstrate knowledge of these verses and then provide a coherent argument as to their internal inconsistency. And he has to prove the Quran is not preserved, which and all of these are impossible tasks that I've set before him. And after a fraction of the evidence that we as Muslims have has been presented. With that being said, I conclude my opening statement and I hand it back to you, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan.
Okay, thank you for that. Hopefully my audio is good. Is my audio good?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for that presentation, Brother Yemeni. And I do apologize, I interrupted on 10 minutes, thinking that your opening presentation is for 10 minutes, but King Servant politely reminded me that it's actually 30 minutes. Thank you for that, King Servant. I really appreciate your cooperation. Also, I'd like to mention that King Servant has got rights and the opportunity to have and download this debate onto his own channel. So of course the permission has been given to King Servant to upload it onto his own channel. So please keep that in mind. Also, I really appreciate the mods for keeping everything in order in the discussion. We don't want some of this negative comments in the chat, and unfortunately, we get that even from Muslims. So please, thank you for the moderation and keeping everything top quality. Absolutely fantastic. Without further ado, I will be stepping down, and then hopefully King Servant can start his 10-minute presentation. Let me
30 minutes.
See what I mean, guys? Here we go again. So I'm going to drop down and then hopefully give your presentation for 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. Okay, so of course sorry, I'll just restart my time. So I know how long I've got. Right, I'll start now. So the question before us today is, of course, was Muhammad a true prophet? Now, for myself as a Christian, if I were to use the Christian criteria as found in the Bible, this is an extremely straightforward question to answer. The biblical perspective on Muhammad is that the one who denies the Father and the Son is the Antichrist. It also says in the New Testament that if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. This would obviously apply to Muhammad. Anyone who has ignored the law of Moses is put to death without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much more severe punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? That's Hebrews 10, 28 to 29. Now, if Yemeni wants me to apply biblical criteria, what does the Bible say? Is Muhammad a false prophet according to the Bible? Obviously, there's no question about that. So let's move on. Let's see what happens when we look at Muhammad from an outside, external perspective. For the sake of comparison, consider the character of Robin Hood. Let's say we were debating the topic, Robin Hood was the best archer ever. According to the sources on his life, he clearly was. He is presented that way. And these stories not only present him that way, but they include real people and places, such as King Richard, Prince John, Sherwood Forest, and Nottingham, and so forth. However, it's widely recognized that there's far too much room for legendary exaggeration. That is about 150 to 200 years before the earliest sources on his life, for us to draw a conclusion like that. Indeed, scholars debate his very existence. He may have been based on a real person, but we don't have enough to draw this kind of a conclusion. So who was Muhammad? He's only mentioned 4 times in the Quran, which tells us almost nothing about him using that book alone. The earliest surviving biography of Muhammad comes from Ibn Ishaq, which was 120 years after the traditional date of Muhammad's death. But we don't have that. What we have comes instead from Ibn Hisham, from about 833 AD. He removed, in his own words, things which it is disgraceful to discuss, matters which would distress certain people, among other things. We can only guess what those might have been, apart from perhaps reports elsewhere. To read it, it appears like fantasy. It includes things like pagans torturing beetles until they confess belief in pagan goddesses. I'm not saying this because I reject miracles, but I think even a Muslim and a Christian can agree that this kind of a suggestion is quite actually absurd. But not only that, it includes miracles and other stories that seem to be directly copied from the Gospels. And it seems to follow it in terms of its format as well. It begins with his genealogy, like Matthew and Luke do. His birth and name are announced to his mother in advance. It even includes a star and an equivalent of the wise men at his birth. However, this is generally not considered reliable by Muslims as well as Christians, even though they must use it or similar biographies to piece together events in Muhammad's life. So what do Sunnis consider reliable? The Hadith collections, you can see the dates of the collections there, ranging in general from 200 to 300 years after Muhammad. That's, of course, the date of the collection. I'm not arguing that they were all invented at that point. And then you have the manuscripts ranging from 1000 onwards. I'm making an exception for the Muwatta of Ibn Malik. If we want to discuss that at a future point, we can. Of course, there are narrations found in there, also found in other Hadith collections. That comes from about 150 plus years after Muhammad. Sahih Bukhari is a good example of a Hadith collection. It's the most commonly appealed to one by Sunnis. This is allegedly a collection of oral reports from around 846 AD by Bukhari, who supposedly traveled around memorizing 500,000 or more tales of what Muhammad said or did, along with the chains of people who allegedly passed them down to his time. He would then assess the reliability of each person, much like Yemeni described in his opening statement. The source on how many hadith he collected together comes another 250 years after Bukhari's life, and from someone who doesn't provide any chain of narration or historical source for where he gets that number from. Now, the place of the alleged prophet. According to tradition, Muhammad was born and preached in Mecca, which is, of course, in the Hijaz, West Central Arabia. The word Mecca is only found once in the Quran, which gives no indication that it is a city in the location of modern Mecca, and there is much reason to conclude that in the 7th century there was no such major city. Manuscripts in Arabia are very well preserved in the dry environment there, yet we have no reference to such a city by friends, enemies, trading partners, or neighbors, despite plentiful references to other supposedly much more insignificant towns like Yathrib, Taif, Najran, etc. The earliest mention of Mecca, specifically, outside of the Quran, of course, is in the 8th century. There's also an unusually high rate of Persian loanwords in the Quran, which could suggest a northern source. And you can see examples of them there. There's a much lower frequency of Persian loanwords in other Arabic writing that come from Central Arabia. When we look at the Quran itself, there seems to be good evidence there that it was not intended for a Meccan audience. Crops are referenced which were not grown in Mecca due to lack of water, which of course is a major problem for providing water for people as well. In Surah 6, verse 99, it says, "He it is who sendeth down water from the sky, and therewith we bring forth buds of every kind. We bring forth the green blade, from which we bring forth the clustered grain, and the date palm, and the pollen, and the spring and pendant bunches. We bring forth gardens of grapes, and the olive and pomegranate, alike and unlike. Look upon the fruit thereof." The audience is expected to be able to see these things themselves in their own area, when they bear fruit and upon its ripening. This is not a description of Mecca, surely not. Also, regarding the ruins of Sodom, the supposedly Meccan audience are told that they pass by them in the morning and at night. Do you not understand? Now, if we were to grant a minimal level of usefulness to biographical material, which I kind of doubt that they're worth that much, we would find that the Satanic Verses incident, in which Muhammad allegedly spoke revelation encouraging prayer to pagan goddesses, the daughters of Allah, by which those prayers would then be taken to Allah, and then he claimed that Satan had cast these words upon him and he mistook them for the angel Gabriel or so forth. We find he makes statements like, "I have fabricated against God and have said on God's behalf that which he did not say. And I have obeyed Satan and spoken his words, and he has become a partner in God's matter with me." This, of course, is said in one way or another, depending on which report you choose to go with. I'm not arguing that any of them are reliable, but what we do find is, as Shahab Ahmed notes in his book Before Orthodoxy, it is a fact that the Muslim community in the first 200 years pretty much universally believed the satanic verses incident to be true. This therefore meets the criteria of ijma, that is, under the Sunni doctrine, that the scholars of Islam cannot unite around error. However, in the early Muslim community, they did unite around agreement on the satanic verses before doctrines changed and it became more and more rejected over time. Interestingly enough, there is a narration from Bukhari. I don't pretend I think it actually goes back to Muhammad, but of course, my opponent is bound to Sunni orthodoxy, which requires that the best people are those of the earliest generations of Muslims. So it was an agreement among the best of Muslims compared with an agreement that exists in contemporary Islam, that this did not take place. Now, we've got to ask the question, were the revelations that Muhammad supposedly got influenced by his own desires? It certainly looks like it if you look at the literature surrounding the supposed revelation of the Quran. Again, this is all relying on literature which is really far too late to be taken seriously, but if we do consider what it says, we find things like this. The incident of Mary the Copt, where there was a slave girl with whom Muhammad used to have intercourse, but Aisha and Hafsa wouldn't leave him alone until he said that she was forbidden to him. Now, instead of keeping his word and leaving his slave girl alone, he got a revelation from his God, supposedly, saying, O prophet, why dost thou prohibit thyself that which Allah hath made lawful for you, seeking to please your wives? It then continues, Allah has ordained for you the dissolution of your oaths. It may be that, this is directly speaking to Muhammad's wives, it may be that his Lord, if he divorce you, will give him in exchange wives better than you. So what does this actually mean? What are we saying happened? According to Sunni Islam, God spoke from heaven, telling Muhammad not to practice restraint, not to withhold himself from having intercourse with his slave girl, not to keep his promises. We have ordained to you dissolution of your oaths, so don't keep your promise not to do that anymore. Don't try to please your wives, and instead, God threatens them with divorce and replacement if they don't go along with this. Now, the question, of course, is, what is the best explanation of the evidence that we have available? When it comes to subjects like this, I am suggesting that the best explanation is not that God decided to give Muhammad the right to sleep with his slave girls because he just wants to give Muhammad whatever he wants, or to encourage slavery and treating slaves this way. I'm suggesting that the best explanation is that whether through mental illness, demonic influence, whatever else, an explanation that is not divine in origin makes more sense in cases like this. And I would go further and suggest that when we look at the whole corpus of the hadith, the picture that we get is not just the flowery one that Al-Yemeni painted for us. Admittedly, he is relying on authentic hadith by Sunni standards. But when we look at everything that's available, the best explanation of these things is that some look more obviously made up than others. Others are less likely to be the kinds of things that Muslims would make up. And what is the best explanation as a whole? That Muhammad is not a true prophet, but instead he is getting his revelations from, in some sense, his own desires and his desire to fulfill them. Similarly, with the case of Zainab. According to tradition, and I cite Tabari here and others, Muhammad saw his cousin Zainab's body. She was married to his adopted son, and when he saw her, he exclaimed out loud, revealing his desire for her to her. When her husband Zayd heard of this, he offered to divorce her for him, that is, for Muhammad. Muhammad refused. I would say it was the right thing to do. This incident nevertheless led to their divorce anyway, and God rebuked Muhammad for not accepting Zayd's offer and admitting his desire for his wife. The explanation in the Quran is that this was to show Muslims it's okay to marry their adopted sons' wives after they have divorced them. You can read this in chapter 33, verse 37. Shortly afterwards, in Surah 33, verses 4 and 5, the Quran, of course, isn't in chronological order, of the Quran, which is titled Abolition of Adoption by Ibn Kathir. Some Muslims have attempted to water down what this actually entails, but Ibn Kathir is quite straightforward about what it is. Adoption in the community was ended, making that reason completely useless since adopted sons no longer existed. But it actually gets worse, because the original marriage between Zainab and her first husband Zayd took place against Zainab's will, and it was only finalized after Muhammad's God again stepped in earlier, telling her not to resist whatever he decides and to go into this marriage anyway. This is recorded in the 36th verse of the same chapter. It does not behove a believer, male or female, that when Allah and his messenger have decided an affair, that they should exercise their choice. And whoever disobeys Allah and his messenger has strayed to manifest error. And you can see some citations for that here. So let's summarize. I don't want to get lost in details. According to Islam, God again spoke from heaven, forcing Zainab into a marriage she didn't want to Muhammad's adopted son, then rebuking Muhammad for hiding his desire for her, following that up with insisting that this same woman marry Muhammad instead, so that Muslims know it's okay to marry their adopted sons' wives after they've been divorced. And then he declares adoption abolished. This is what God did, according to Islam. What is the best explanation for that? Is it that this is actually the case and this is actually what happened? Or is it, assuming that the story has any authenticity at all, that Muhammad is being led by what he wants? If he wants her to marry his adopted son, he gets a revelation saying that. If he wants to marry her, he gets a revelation saying that. If it's a little bit awkward because she was his adopted son's wife, he gets a revelation getting rid of adoption. Is this a coincidence? Or is the better explanation that these revelations are not coming from God? This hardly needs much comment from me, but the Quran rebukes people for annoying Muhammad by not leaving immediately after they've had a meal at his home. And it also forbids people to speak to his wives except under particular conditions and so forth. The indication that this is to please Muhammad is quite blatantly sitting there in the text. Now, we have the interesting case of Muhammad's scribe. He himself apparently is a source of the Quran, at least according to some reports. It's written that when Muhammad dictated to him, who heareth and knoweth all things, his scribe would write it, all-knowing, all-wise. And this resulted in his scribe doubting and leaving Islam. Then he said, if Muhammad gets inspiration, then I get inspiration too. And if Allah sent him his revelation, then I was sent the same thing. In other words, if Muhammad's a prophet, I'm just as much a prophet as he is. And I'm no prophet, so I'm out of here. Another case referring to the same man. The Messenger of Allah invited him once so that he could write something. And we have a case where Abdullah was apparently amazed by a particular detail in the Quran and added, so blessed be Allah, the best to create. The Messenger of Allah said, that's how it was revealed to me. So Abdullah doubted then and said to himself, if Muhammad were truthful, then I was revealed what he was revealed. And if he were a liar, then I said what he said. This resulted in him, of course, leaving Islam. Yes, there are reports of him returning to Islam under pressure for his life, but when he has the option, he chooses not to be Muslim. Now, we also find record that Muhammad was accused of repeating anything that he heard and believing whatever was being circulated. Yemeni did touch on this, but we'll no doubt get into this in more detail. It was said of a particular individual that it was him who said Muhammad is all he is. If anyone tells him anything, he believes it. And there happens to be a revelation directed at him as well for saying such a thing about Muhammad. The Quran records that Muhammad was, or the author of the Quran, whoever that is, was accused of producing nothing but tales and fables of the ancients. It's interesting that a pre-Islamic poet, at least according to Islamic tradition, came out with exactly the same thing, the saying of the moon splitting that is found in the Quran. I don't know if you can see the comment at the bottom of the slide here, hopefully you can, but the one difference in the phrase is at a point in which there are several different variant readings in the Quran. Variant readings is what they are. The origins I'm not commenting on, at least at this point. Now, let's talk about Abraham and the fire that we find in the Quran. The Quran records an incident where Abraham was thrown into a fire and God saved him. The origins of this report are exegetical, not historical. It's a story that is based on reinterpretation of the Bible, not historical reporting. The Bible records Abraham was called by God to leave a place called Ur-Kasdim, Ur of the Chaldees, and I've got the reference there. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide a picture of the ruins of that city. We know it's a city, we've dug it up, we've investigated it. Not me personally, but scholars have done this and the evidence is very available. Now, Nimrod was identified as Zarathustra by ancient Greeks. According to tafsir on the Quran, and I think there's a virtual consensus among tafsir, that Nimrod is the one who threw Abraham into the fire. But he was identified as Zarathustra by ancient Greeks. That goes back a long way. Using the similarity between the Hebrew word or, which means fire, and the name of the city that he was taken out of by God, as a polemic against Zoroastrianism, rabbis theologically expanded what the Bible said into the idea that Abraham survived being thrown into a fire by Nimrod. So we know the origins of this story. We know where the idea that this took place comes from. It doesn't come from history. It doesn't come from any attempt to reconstruct what actually happened based on what people saw, what they've written down, or anything that was produced by a person claiming to have this knowledge from God. It was produced by rabbis in order to attack Zoroastrianism. That's where this story developed from. And yet it is presented as if it were historical fact in the Quran. Therefore, whoever brought this supposed revelation from God is a false prophet. And I'll certainly grant, for the sake of argument, that was Muhammad. You can see here, Yeshai Kael, in his article, Abraham and Nimrod in the Shadow of Zarathustra, writes, the motif of Abraham's miraculous deliverance from a fire is completely absent from the Hebrew Bible. It's not found in the earliest sources on Muhammad's life by a long shot. Although supposed scriptural traces of this motif were delineated by Second Temple exegetes. Now, in case the audience doesn't know what that means, Second Temple exegetes, that is essentially around the time of Jesus. You're talking well over 1,000 years after the events took place. Using these earlier pieces of tradition, rabbinic and Islamic authors attempted to weave together a coherent narrative telling the story of Abraham's miraculous emergence from the fiery furnace. And you can see here where Nimrod, the son of Cush, is identified as Zoroaster by Epiphanius, who lived in approximately the year 400. In the so-called Tafsir of Ibn Abbas, of course, Ibn Abbas didn't write a Tafsir. This is a collection of reports that are narrated to him. Nimrod is identified as the one who threw Abraham into the fire. And here we have the report, or I should say the commentary that rabbis put together to attack Zoroastrianism, again citing Nimrod, who wanted to worship fire, sending Abraham into this furnace, but surviving by the power of God. Now, finally, let's talk about Alexander the Great and Dul-Qarnayn. According to the Quran, the prophet of the Quran, let's call him Muhammad, was asked about the two-horned one, Dul-Qarnayn. The Quran claims that he traveled to where the sun sets in a pool of water, and then he turned around and went to the rising place of the sun. He also built a wall between two mountains to keep out the tribes of Gog and Magog. Now, of course, here's where the source criticism comes in. The Syriac legend of Alexander records him building this wall, which is contemporaneous with or earlier than the Quran. There's no way that this could be derived from the Quran. And you can see on the right-hand side a 4th century BC coin showing Alexander with the horns of Ammon, which of course was an Egyptian god. So he was completely pagan, and that's what the horns are referring to, the horns of Ammon given to him by this pagan god. Pseudo-Jacob, who again wrote before or contemporaneously with the Quran, has a writing entitled On Alexander, the Believing King, and on the gate which he made against Gog and Magog. There's no question that this is referring to Alexander. Here we have another source on Alexander, one of the Alexander romances, which says that Alexander builds a brass and iron door to shut in the nations of Gog and Magog. And you can see on the other side the Quran, which clearly identifies Dul-Qarnayn in relation to Gog and Magog, building a door out of, in this case it says copper and iron. There can be no question that this is derived from or connected with any other figure than the Alexander myth of the Alexander romances. The historical Alexander did not do this. No one in history did this or was asserted to have built a wall to keep out Gog and Magog. There is no one else. This is talking about Alexander. He was a pagan, which is why so many Muslim apologists desperately want to deny that it's talking about Alexander. And this wall does not exist. There are not Gog and Magog hiding behind a brass and iron door that is keeping them out. Furthermore, no one has traveled to the rising place of the sun. There is no rising place of the sun to travel to. Once again, the Quran is reporting as historical fact things which are fictional. This is fantasy fiction where a historical figure has a legend that has developed over time. And notice, he's identified as a believer, and the Christians who are writing this end with a hymn of praise to God and our Lord Jesus Christ. The idea that Alexander was some kind of a believer is found in the Alexander romances. He was consistently identified as the two-horned one. We can see that from the coins and elsewhere. And only he can be the candidate that the Quran is speaking about here. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your time. And I'll be interested to see how Al-Yemeni responds to the evidence that I presented that Muhammad was a false prophet.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, King Servant. Very interesting. We've got some really good feedback in the chat. Guys, keep that coming in. Questions will be taken, but only written questions in the chat. So make sure when you write a question, make sure it's addressed to the particular person that it's actually aimed for. This is going to be a very interesting moment now. Brother Yemeni will have 10 minutes to rebuttal King Servant's presentation, and then vice versa. So brothers and sisters, stay tuned. We've still got some interesting rebuttals going to take place, and then of course we've got a cross-examination where I think it's definitely going to get warmed up and very interesting. So Brother Yemeni, you'll have 10 minutes to rebuttal the presentation, and vice versa, King Servant. So I'll be stepping down, and then you can continue. You're muted, Brother Yemeni. You're muted.
Sorry, I was just so excited for this rebuttal. Right, okay, I'm going to start. Let me just reset my time here. Okay, I'm going to start it now, inshallah. Bismillah. All right, so I'm going to start with the last thing that King Servant said, which is evidence. Well, I'm sorry, but you say evidence. I've heard nothing but assumption. In fact, you even said, I believe, and let's call him Muhammad, highlighting that you're actually not sure of what's going on here. But let's address things in a chronological sense. You mentioned about the biblical criteria that Muslims deny the Father and the Son. No, we don't. We believe that who you refer to as Allah is actually, the Father is Allah, and who you refer to as the Son is Isa alayhi salam. But again, like I mentioned to you in my opening statement, you have to actually prove your theological basis to be correct before you say, because now it's just circular reasoning. A different gospel. And to ignore the law of Moses, this is very ironic, because I'm pretty sure Paul wrote that, and he's the one that ignored the law of Moses. Very interesting that you bring that up as your criteria. You talk about Muhammad ﷺ being mentioned 4 times in the Quran. This is a fundamental error. This is only by name. He is addressed many more times with his title, with various titles: messenger, prophet, OU, say. These are all addresses of the Prophet ﷺ. You talk about the 120 years of the biography. This is until we get the biography, but that's not what I'm arguing today. I'm not arguing for historical reliability based on biography, which the authors themselves acknowledged that not everything within their literature was authentic. They themselves knew that. So this is why I relied upon authentic narrations, things that can be verified historically. Unfortunately, you didn't challenge that, but I hope you will in your rebuttal. This idea of removing distressing information. Well, I'm pretty sure that a lot of Christian apologists use information that will be quote unquote distressing, which highlights that our authentic tradition is not about that. It's about preserving information as it is, whether it's damaging towards Islam in the eyes of others or not. Hadith collections. Well, you've already admitted that you are not arguing that these are when they were made up, rather their compilation. So I'm not sure why you brought it up in the first place. You did mention about Bukhari and about him memorizing the 500,000 hadith, but I'm not sure that you actually quite understand what's going on there, because when we talk about the 500,000 or 600,000, this is actually in reference to the chains of narration more than the reports. It's not 600,000 individual reports. It's more about the isnad than anything else, because that is what verifies our history. In the Quran, you went down a very unusual route. You tried to argue that Mecca didn't exist. And you mentioned chapter 6, verse 99, which is not referring to Mecca. Very superficial research will tell you that this is not referring to Mecca. And about the place of Solomon, that you see the place of Solomon. This is a general linguistic device used by the Quran. In fact, the Quran also mentions about seeing things that mankind don't see. Have you seen how Allah has subhanahu wa ta'ala has held up the skies? This is not something we see, right? So you've got to understand Quranic language, and unfortunately you've demonstrated you don't know that. The satanic verses. Now, what's interesting about your argument is that you said that the Ummah will be united upon, would not unite upon error, and we are in complete agreement. But where is your evidence that the Ummah, or the 3 generations, as you put it, actually agreed that this is an authentic narration? Provide me a single source from any of the companions or their students that, had a consensus among them that this is an authentic report. In fact, every single report of this is actually fabricated. Now, you said that one of your arguments against the Prophet ﷺ, or as you say, let's call him Muhammad, because you're not even sure who the author is, but then you go to argue that this is about him. Again, very confusing. You talk about the incident of the honey. Now, first and foremost, you need to understand Islam, right? I feel like this rebuttal is more of a lesson than anything. In Islam, if you make an oath which is not a good oath, you can actually retract it. Okay, so this is something that's permissible. When it comes to Zainab, you mentioned 2 inauthentic reports. So I have to ask you, did you check the authenticity of these reports? The idea that she wasn't, that she did not agree to the marriage is an inauthentic report, and the one that mentions that he lusted after her is an inauthentic report. The idea of annoying the Prophet ﷺ, in fact, this is actually used for Islamic learning. When it comes to guests should not overstay their welcome. And at the end of the day, what's wrong with Allah prioritizing his prophets with regards to certain matters? You also spoke about not speaking to his wives. Well, actually, this is a thing for all Muslim men. We do not allow other men to speak to our wives without, just willy-nilly. So this is a teaching for the Muslims, as well as an instruction regarding the Prophet ﷺ. You also mentioned 3 reports, 2 of them regarding Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh. Again, newsflash, they're inauthentic reports. Okay, and the funny thing is that you provided a report that actually refutes you. The one that mentions that he was a scribe in Mecca. Guess what? Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh reverted in Medina. He became a Muslim in Medina. So how could he be even a scribe for the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca? This is a fundamental 80s argument that has been refuted decades ago. Now, you try to compare the moon splitting to pre-Islamic poetry. And you mentioned what is in the Qira'at. I'm not understanding the correlation there. You need to explain that to me. But with regards to its comparison with pre-Islamic poetry, you have a line. And even that, it's not the same thing, right? You have to demonstrate that that passage in the Quran is poetry, but you don't have the linguistic ability to do so. So again, you should stick to things that you can actually argue in evidence, because I'm yet to see any evidence from you, King Servant, unfortunately. With regards to Abraham and the fire and its origins, because it is mentioned in the Quran in chapter 21:69, you say that this has been developed by the Jews. Well, you don't have any evidence that it was developed by the Jews. That's simply your earliest source of the material. So you assume it is developed at that point in time. You also mentioned Ibn Abbas, quoting, again, a source that you know is not written by him. Now, what's interesting about the source that you quoted is that we know that Ibn Abbas quoted from the people of the book to fill in gaps with regards to what is mentioned in the Quran. But Ibn Abbas himself didn't say that this is what do you call it, that this is 100% how it happened or anything like that. He doesn't make that certain claim. This is simply a good an interesting exercise to fill in the gaps that are not as important with regards to our religion and learning about it and benefiting from it. Alexander the Great, you said before all contemporary. Which one is it? Are you not sure about your sources? You said that we deny this because Alexander was a pagan. Well, no, actually, we deny that there is a link between them because there is no historical link between the Prophet ﷺ and the Alexander romance. You need to establish that link. Prove to me that the Prophet ﷺ actually heard this story. Don't assume things. Another absurd argument is that you said there is no war. Well, what if God doesn't want us to see the war? What if that's its purpose? It is not to be seen until the time comes when they are released. It's a very, very silly argument. And again, the rising of the sun, I'm only going to address it because you said it. It's from his perspective. It's from his perspective. Now, also, when it comes to this idea of fiction and myths and everything, don't you know that there is a common saying that myth is usually has roots in truth, right? So there must be some truth behind it, but then later it got mixed up with different things and then fell into myth and legend. So why are you going to assume that this is something that you need to provide evidence which you don't have? And this is the problem that you have with your methodology. So yes, this is everything that you've mentioned, and I have a minute and a half to spare. So I'm going to donate that to you, King Servant, because I think you need it for your rebuttal against mine, because, like I said to you, I have given you an impossible task, and I wait to see your response.
Okay, thank you for that response, King Servant. When you're ready, you'll have the same amount of time if you want more. Brother Yemeni has been generous enough to give you a minute and a half extra, so you can have 11 and a half minutes to take up your rebuttal. Let me know when you're ready and I'll drop down.
Yeah, thank you. If I could just bring my slides back up, because Yemeni did ask for some clarifications on what I had. I'd be happy to provide that. I'll just find the relevant slide before I begin, which would be slide 24. Right. Yeah, I'll begin now. Thank you. So, Yemeni was asking me regarding what the comment I made about Karat and Imru al-Qais. So the text is, as you see on the screen, the hour is drawn near and the moon is split. And this is identical in the Quran and in the writing of Imru al-Qais. The only difference between them are invariant readings that are different depending on which Karat you read. So the text is not fixed in the one place where they don't match perfectly with each other. So that was the point that I was making there. So hopefully that's clear. Now, obviously, there was an awful lot of material that Yemeni gave me, but I would begin by pointing out that the entire argument appears to rest on the idea that the traditional narratives of Muhammad's life are accurate. Now, if we go back to my slide, I said he's only mentioned 4 times in the Quran. I should have said by name. That's, of course, correct. But we also have the comments regarding the place of the Prophet Mecca, because I'm asked about why hadith are unreliable. The fact that the hadith do not match the archaeological record with regard to the place of Mecca in itself draws them seriously into doubt. The hadith present Mecca as if it were on a major trade route. Mecca was not on a major trade route. If it were on a major trade route, there would be reference to it by people who passed through who were trading. It would be mentioned by the same people who talked about Yathrib, Taif, and Najran. So I want to ask Yemeni, do you recognize that Mecca was smaller and less significant than Taif and Najran? Because if you do, and that explains the lack of evidence for it, it's not even mentioned until the 8th century by anybody outside one possible reference in the Quran, then the hadith that assume an entirely different historical narrative are not reliable. And if it was the trade center and trading route center that it's made out to be, why has nobody heard of it? Now, Muhammad, because he allegedly called to monotheism, this is apparently supposed to be evidence that Muhammad was a true prophet. But we find, according to the research of Ahmed al-Jalad, who has researched the epigraphy, that is the stone inscriptions in Arabia, that every single inscription past the 5th century that's the 5th century AD, was exclusively monotheistic in Arabia. So the entire narrative that he is preaching monotheism to a group of pagans who worship multiple gods doesn't fit the archaeological evidence. Now, that's something that needs to be dealt with. This calls the entire narrative of Hadith and where they come from and their reliability into question. Now, he appealed to prophecies. First of all, where do you get the dating for when these prophecies were given? Islamic tradition. I don't accept Islamic tradition as authoritative. No non-Muslim does, unless they're already being influenced by what Muslim da'is are giving them. Non-Muslim historians don't take the traditional dating of the Quran for granted, which you have to do in order to say that this prophecy was made at the time you claim. Also, the time gap is 3 to 9 years. That is a reasonably long length of time. And there was a back and forth between the Romans and the Persians, one side winning and then the other side winning for many years. So that's not unusual. Then you have the question of the prophecy of barefoot naked shepherds building tall buildings. Well, you should look at what the rest of that hadith says. It contains things which are not fulfilled at all, if they ever could be. It talks about, I'm going to have to look up the reference. I'm not sure I've got time to do it right now. Perhaps I'll do it in my next rebuttal. But it records, oh, here we are, actually. 5 things which no one knows except Allah. It says that women will give birth to their mistresses. I don't know what that's referring to. And destitute shepherds competing in making tall buildings. Are they destitute? I don't think so. These things are very questionable when you actually look into the rest of what the text says. They're not barefoot, they're not naked, they're not destitute, they're not even shepherds anymore. And yeah, they're competing in making tall buildings. That's the one thing that's actually relevant. The women giving birth to their mistresses, not the case. As far as prophecies as well, it was interesting because Yemeni actually brought the hadith on the slide that jinn apparently sneak into heaven and listen to what Allah's plans are and then go and tell fortune tellers what's going to happen. But they mix in falsehood with the truth. By even an Islamic standard, you can't use this to judge if Muhammad is a true prophet or not, because not only does there appear to be falsehood mixed in with it, as I pointed out, but the jinn could have snuck into heaven and then ran back with a shooting star being shot after them to tell him as a fortune teller what was going on. I'm not saying I believe any of that, but it's not even a good criteria by your own standard. 3 questions that only a prophet knows. You never said what those questions were, Yemeni. The first meal of paradise. I forget the second one, but the third one is, why does a child resemble the father or the mother? I'm not sure I even want to say that live, but it's whichever one is first during sexual intercourse. That is what determines whether a child resembles the father or the mother. These are the questions that only a prophet would know, apparently. There's only one of them we can verify, and it's false. And at the time, they couldn't verify any one of them. I'm not even saying that I think Muhammad said this, but if he did, was not a good reason to accept him as a prophet. Very good reason to doubt it. Now, I've been given the opportunity to argue that the Quran is not from God based on contradiction. So let's do that. It's not a challenge that can't be met, so let's do it. Is the Quran clear or not? According to a variety of verses, it is clear, and some go even further and say that it is clear with every verse explained in detail, or this sort of language. However, if you read chapter 3, verse 7, it says that the disbelievers focus on the unclear parts of the Quran, and it's only the mother of the book, whatever that refers to, that is clear. Ironically, that's not awfully clear. I mean, the mother of the book may be a reference to specific parts of the Quran, but I'll leave that up for grabs. Furthermore, are Christians polytheists or not? Actually, I hate the translation polytheist. Are they mushrikun or not? Are they associated or not? That would be a better way to translate it. According to some verses, yes, we are. We are called that. According to other verses, no, we're not. We're distinguished and separated from them such that, according to Muslim jurisprudence, you may marry you may not marry a polytheist, but you may marry a Christian woman. That means they are not polytheists. That is a contradiction in the Quran. Same thing, interestingly, with is Muhammad a father to Muslims or not? It is denied explicitly in the Quran, but in a variant reading, it is recorded that he was a father to them. That is the Qur'at of Ubay ibn Ka'b, and you can find that in Yusuf Ali's footnote, page 1104. Now, I'll just make a couple of final comments on the preservation of the Quran while I've got 30 seconds left on the clock. And you will find that in the narration by Abu Musa, I think it's Sahih Muslim 6666, but I'm going off the top of my head, could be wrong. He is speaking to the people of Basra and mentions 2 chapters that were forgotten. And this is not a good thing that they were forgotten. My opponent will doubtless say that they were abrogated, but I'm going to have to wait for my rebuttal period to address that if he decides to. The same can be said of many other narrations which record missing parts of the Quran over time.
Okay, thank you for that rebuttal. Brother Yemeni did give you extra minute and a half. I don't know if you heard that prior to you starting. Are you happy to stop, or do you want another minute and a half?
We can stop here. I think it's an opportune
Fantastic. Moment. Thank you for that. I'd like to just remind the audience, there's well over 200 people watching. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the stream. And yeah, just share it with your friends and family on social media. You know, of course, this is very beneficial. So we need to share the dawah, and you must play a part in this contribution of learning and education on both sides. Either though you're a Christian or even you're a Muslim, it's still an education, a learning process for all of us. But now we're going to a very interesting. I'm assuming we're going to have another 10-minute rebuttal. So stay. Brother Yemeni,
it's 7 minutes for our second rebuttal.
Okay, not bad. So we're going to 7 minutes now, times 2. So brothers and sisters, stay seated and look forward to Brother Yemeni's rebuttal, and of course King Servant will respond soon after. Brother Yemeni, I'll be stepping down and then you can begin.
Sure, inshallah. I will start my time now. All right. So as expected, there was no actual evidence presented by King Servant for my opening presentation, nothing but assumption. But let's address what he mentioned in his first rebuttal. He said hadith is different to what we find archaeologically, right? We don't have any mention of Mecca. Well, actually, Diodorus of Sicily in the 1st century BC mentions of a temple that was revered by the Arabs. Now, some people think this is referring to the Gulf of Aqaba because it mentions Gulf, but what King Servant actually needs to do is actually provide evidence of a temple that was revered by the Arabs at that time, other than Mecca. Also, pre-Islamic poetry, he actually used, I'm not placed, but pre-Islamic poetry speaks about Abraha and the event of the elephant, right? So if you're going to use pre-Islamic poetry, then use it, you know, and that will demonstrate that there was actually something. And this is actually how we know the year of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. He was born in the year of the elephant. We know this from pre-Islamic poetry. But again, you're looking at Mecca, which is a city that is constantly being developed. The Haram itself has been constantly developed, and it's now at a size that actually exceeds the boundaries of the original city. So when you talk about looking for archaeological evidence, obviously you won't find it in that particular space because the haram in of itself already expands so much of that space. But then he says there was no archaeological evidence, but then says, but there was archaeological evidence of only monotheism in the 5th century. But again, you're not referring to Mecca, you are referring to other parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Mecca in of itself is a continuously developing city, unlike other regions of the Hijaz, which have things being preserved. And then talk about tradition, dating. How do we know this? Well, we've already established this is from the Isnad system. We trace it all the way back. Ilm Rijal. You are the one that has to disprove that, which you haven't yet. You haven't proven this. When you talk about not understanding women giving birth to its masters, it's in reference to the disrespect of children. So mothers will give birth to children who then grow up and disrespect them and order around as if they are their masters. When you come to the Bedouin prophecy, and the fact that you had a contention with it astounds me, because at the end of the day, you only went off a translation with regards to some sort of meaning put in. If you actually look at the Arab text, it doesn't mention they are naked. You have to look at the Arabic text. I mean, we have Google Translate. You can put it into Google Translate if you want to get a fairly accurate reading of it. You know, we've got technology at our hands. You should use it. What else did you mention? Oh, yes, the hadith of resembling the parents. You thought I didn't quote it because it's something that is, falsifies the Prophet. Actually, it was on the screen, but for the sake of time, I skipped over it. But let's address it now, considering you've brought it up. There is actually no scientific demonstration of this. No one has actually gone forward and actually studied this. So it remains unfalsifiable to this point. Unless you can provide some scientific discourse that actually shows that this is not the case, you don't actually have anything. Because at the moment, the only thing that is proven is regarding genetics, not regarding who first, mixes falsehood thing. But you're talking about this is a category area. We're talking about prophecies, and you're talking about the mixing of falsehood by the jinn with regards to historical information. And have you not seen your category error here? The Quran is clear, and you mentioned that this is referring to every verse. The Quran doesn't say every verse. In fact, you gave me the reconciliation. An internal contradiction means things that can't be reconciled. When the Quran says that this is a detailed explanation of all things, okay, and it refers to the interpretation, it explains that it is clear in its understanding that this is a clear Quran, and there is ambiguity to it, and the Prophet ﷺ is to explain it to us, and the Arabic language is there to use, right? These are all reconciliations of these claims. These are not contradictions. I think you need to understand what a contradiction is. Now, you mentioned another contradiction, apparently, which says that Christians are polytheists, but they also refer to them as the people of the book, and you can marry them. Therefore, they're not polytheists. No, it just shows that the Christians have a special place with Allah, despite being polytheists. That's why he refers to them as the people of the book, and therefore we can marry their women, and even that has its criteria. The woman has to be chaste. So in other words, Muslims take the best of the Christians, the Christian women, and we leave you the worst of the Christian women, the ones that are unchaste. Then you mention about the verses that have disappeared. Of course, I say it is abrogated. You have to prove that these are not abrogated verses, that they are simply things that have been forgotten, lost by accident, and not deliberately removed from the Quran during the revelatory period. That is on you to substantiate, not for me. And again, I'm left with a minute and 40 seconds. I don't know what to say anymore. I've rejected everything you've said. All that is left really to say is to reiterate my challenge to you, so that maybe you actually understand what you need to address in your next 7 minutes. If you're arguing externally, which you have, right, provide evidence that our historical method is unreliable. You touched on this a lot. Provide evidence, not speculation. Okay? In terms of the internal, you have to provide a false prophecy. You can't assume it. Disprove his miracle. Don't be like, oh, well, we don't know when this was said. Prove that this was said after the fact. Don't give that thing. You need to stay on point here. provide again the accusation that he just made it up, assuming he made it up because there are some verses that benefit him. Well, what about the verses that don't benefit him? Like he's been commanded to stand up for 2/3 of the night, for large portions of the night. That's not beneficial for him, is it? You know, for his feet to crack under the weight of praying, right? The fact that he has to constantly preach, constantly go through the struggle, constantly go through the persecution that he I think none of this is beneficial for him, right? Why don't you bring that into the picture as well? So you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. This is what we're asking for. The internal consistency, you had a shot at it, but you need to do better. And that's my time.
Oh, well done. Thank you, Yemeni. Appreciate that. Now, Brother King Servant, you'll have 7 minutes to rebuttal that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great. So, first of all, why am I arguing that the Hadith are unreliable? Because the Hadith record a city called Mecca on a major trade route whereby Muhammad is robbing the caravans that go by and forcing the city almost into bankruptcy, leading to several battles. This is not historically verifiable. Not only is it not historically verifiable, it contradicts the historical facts, because there is no mention of a city called Mecca anywhere in the region at all. If it were on a major trade route, it would be there. The location of Mecca is completely inappropriate. Taif is just about 100 miles or so to the east. That was on this trade route. They did talk about it. It did exist, as with Yathrib, Medina. We are not being unreasonable here. If Mecca existed, somebody would have heard of it. Nobody had. Now, when I say if Mecca existed as described in the traditional narratives, maybe it was a tiny town that had nothing to do with trade routes that is so small that, yes, there's no archaeological evidence for stone inscriptions from Mecca whatsoever. You're right about that. But the ones that exist throughout all of Arabia are monotheistic past the 5th century. So much for the entire legend of Muhammad preaching monotheism to people who were worshipping all of these other gods. Maybe there was still some remnants of pagan worship left, but it was not dominant in Arabia at the time whatsoever. False prophecies of Muhammad, if you want one, there is the case where he identifies a particular young boy as being the Antichrist, or at least strongly suggests that. You say that Muhammad does not reject the Father and the Son, but if you actually read the Quran, which I know you have read it, it explicitly says that even the way in which Christians and Jews call God a father is to be rejected. It's not just they're rejecting some concept of Jesus as the literal Son of God. It's rejecting the fatherhood of God completely. It says, if God were your father, then why would he punish you? No, just say we're slaves of Allah, right? So when it comes to the satanic verses, what is your evidence, Yemeni, that it was not agreed in the earliest centuries that the satanic verses took place? There's 50 sources saying it did. Only one of them rejects it, and that's not from one of the Sahaba, and he rejects it on theological, not historical grounds. Yeah, if you want to say the Sahaba didn't agree on it, name me one that disagreed. There are chains, plenty of them to pick from. The situation of Mary the Copt, the honey, yeah, totally true. You actually made a good argument against Hadith there yourself, I think. There are two different circumstances for revelation of that Hadith. The honey is definitely the more of that Quran verse. The honey one, that he's eating honey that his wives didn't like the smell of, is definitely the more palatable of the two. Two contradictory Hadith about the revelation of the same Quran verse is one of the criteria which Joshua Little gives in his 21-point summary of why Hadith cannot be trusted. And you can see his work for more details on that if you want. I don't have a lot of time, as you know. The story of Muhammad's scribe is inauthentic. Who knew? Couldn't have seen that one coming. Now, let's get into what I think is really the crux of the argument. Alexander, I'm assuming a link. Is it an assumed link to say that someone who is known as the two-horned one, who traveled to the east to the rising place of the sun, and to the west to the setting place of the sun, and built a wall for Gog and Magog to keep them out until the day of judgment, is the same person who is being referred to in the Quran? It's clearly the same person. You have the same events in the same order. Name me one other person in history before Islam who is said to have built a wall to keep out Gog and Magog and to have two horns. Can you name me one? Please go ahead if you can. They don't exist. Only one person fits this description, and he fits the same events in the same order as the Quran. This is how derivation of a story is proven historically, not based on a narration saying that Muhammad heard this story from a Greek who read the Alexander Romance. That's not how history is done, Yemeni. It might be, if you want to perpetrate myths and traditions and legends, it's not how we do history to determine where a text comes from and what influenced it. Likewise with the fire. I did not assume that it was made up. I demonstrated how it was made up over time through the link between Zoroaster and Nimrod, and also through the play on words of Ur of the Chaldees and Or of the Chaldees, the fire of the Chaldeans. This is where the story comes from. It did not happen. We know it did not happen because we know why they created this story. They did not create it because they thought it happened historically. They created it because it was a useful polemic to attack Zoroastrians with. And it has no basis in the historical record. It was developed over time and ended up in the Quran. What you claim is a revelation of God. And the same can be said of the Alexander romances. Do we know they predate Islam? Every single scholar who has written on the subject agrees that they predate Islam. Before or contemporaneous, I'll define what that means. The years 570 to 630. There is not enough time for the writing of the Quran and the circulation of it for Christians to take an Islamic story, put it into Christian writing, strip it of its Islamic theology, and present it as though it were completely Christian, not even mention Islam once. Nobody thinks this happened except apologists trying to defend Islam.
Okay, that is spot on. 7 minutes. Thank you, King Servant. Now, Brother Yemeni, you will have another opportunity of 7 minutes, and then, of course, King Servant will finish off after yourself. If I'm not mistaken, you're muted.
I thought, is it a third round of rebuttal, or are we going straight into cross-exam?
No, you said times two, so you got another 7 minutes each.
Oh no, that's like times two. That means I got 7 minutes, he's got 7 minutes. That's what I meant by times two.
All right, okay.
Sorry. That's my fault on how I've communicated that to you.
It's all good. I'm just so intrigued in today's discussion, and I'm sure the audience is responding likewise. It's been really interesting. Some good points being made from both sides. Now, this is going to be a very fascinating section of today's discussion, is the 10-minute of cross-examination. Brother Yemeni, you will have 10 minutes to start off with, and then King Servant will respond with 10 minutes to respond back. But on this particular segment, I will stay on the screen just to make sure that we're staying on topic and not speaking over each other, because I know it's going to get quite heated. So I'll mute myself, but I will observe patiently and watching you guys, okay?
Sure, no problem. All right, so I believe I've got 10 minutes to grill you in this segment, and then you'll have 10 minutes to attempt to do the same. Right, I'll start my 10 minutes now, inshallah. All right, so Daniel, I really want to get into the crux of this, right, with regards to historical reliability. Can you provide concrete evidence that the isnad system is an unreliable historical method?
Oh, for sure. If the Isnad system were reliable, it would not report a Mecca on a trade route which never happened. We know it never happened because of the historical lack of evidence for Mecca by its trading partners and enemies and friends, and the Romans who supposedly entertained the leader of Mecca. That would exist if hadith were reliable.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's not actually a demonstration of the isnad system. This is an assumption based on external evidence. I'm asking you about the isnad system itself. Does the isnad system, is it a poor methodology for establishing history? You need to demonstrate that. Can you do that?
Yeah, it's a poor methodology because it results in absurdities like a city that, as I described.
Okay, I'm gonna approach this from a different angle because in order, I don't think you really understand what's going on. What do the terms tashif, idrab, shudud, and idraj mean, and what are their function?
I don't know.
Okay, so these are. I'm not going to comment because I can't really comment, but just
Sure. I assume it's got
that's
something
fine.
to do with isnad criticism, but I don't know.
Well,
So
yeah, but you don't know what they mean. Okay, fine. So we'll move on to the next question. I'm going to ask you about some things which you try to shift the burden of proof for. Is the satanic verses? Prove to me they're authentic.
Oh, I'm not.
What's your evidence that they're authentic?
I'm not claiming they're authentic. What I'm claiming is that the early Muslim community believed they were authentic, and that's a problem for you.
Okay, fantastic. What is your evidence that the early Muslim community believed it was authentic?
Because there are 50 different references to it with different chains of narration. Not that there are 50 different chains of narration referencing that go back to the Tabi'in. I don't claim that they go back to the Sahaba, even though they're claimed to have. And never once is it disputed on historical grounds, only one occasion based on theological grounds.
Okay. Does the amount of reports signify that it was believed to be authentic on its own?
Given the complete absence of contrary reports, yes.
No, you're incorrect. Okay, so
That's not a question.
we just wanted to, yeah. The other thing that you shifted the burden of proof on was Alexander the Great. Can you provide a link between Alexander the Great and the Prophet, peace be upon him? A conclusive one.
Oh, this isn't the historical Alexander the Great. This is the mythological creation.
I'm not asking about the history. I'm talking about the story itself, historical or myth. Can you prove evidence that the Prophet, peace be upon him, came to know about it in order to put it into the Quran?
Yeah, because he recounts this myth with the same characteristics in the same order as found in the Alexander romances. That's not a coincidence. That is the evidence. And this is the kind of evidence that historians use to show when one story is derived from another. Not the kind of you're asking for.
Sure. Do you believe similarity equates to borrowing?
Yes, if it's the same events in the same order, with the same characteristics and the kind of thing that we've seen. I wouldn't necessarily use the term borrowing, but it's derivation at least. I think the Quran is engaging with what is known in its context. I don't think it's necessarily, you could use the term borrowing, I suppose. It depends how you're using it.
Okay, so borrowing then. Okay. Would you, considering you are utilizing the naturalistic explanation, would you apply this criteria onto your own book? So if you have something in the New Testament and it's similar to something in the Old Testament, would you say that this is a borrowing of the Old Testament historically?
Probably yes, because we don't have the same problem with our scriptures using sources that you do. We don't have a problem with the idea that Luke might be alluding to something in Isaiah when he says that this happened in the life of Jesus, for example. We think that makes the book all the better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, at least you're being consistent. At least you admit that your scripture is borrowing from earlier material. Okay, that's fine. Can you provide evidence that that Abdullah ibn Abi Sarh, or that this is an authentic thing that actually occurred in history? to falsify the Prophet, peace be upon him, as making up revelation?
No, but I think it's interesting that the story exists at all and that it's been preserved. But
Yeah,
I don't necessarily think it's even historical myself.
It's not about what you find interesting; it's about what you can evidence.
Yeah, I don't
okay.
think it's authentic. I'm not going to.
Okay, you don't have. Okay, so curious. With regards to what else you mentioned. Oh yeah, you said the boy is Antichrist. Yeah, you think this is prophecy. Do you think that this is a prophecy the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, made?
I'm going to have to check exactly what the hadith says, but I think there's a reference to if he lives for so long, then something will happen. But I'm going off the
You're
top of my
conflating.
head. I don't have the
Yeah, you're
text of-
conflating reports. You're conflating reports. It's okay. I still have just under 4 minutes. Do you believe that when it comes to the biblical criteria, do you believe that we should explain or affirm the same theology as you, even though you disagree with the Jews regarding the theology, despite you both reading the same scriptures?
I have no clue what that has to do with whether Muhammad is a true prophet or not, but I think
Because
that
I'll explain to you why this is relevant. Because you, in your opening statement, you started off with biblical criteria, denying the Father and the Son, different gospel, and the law of Moses. This is biblical criteria. So
okay.
why should we accept your criteria, considering your theology is that from the different to that of the Jews, even though you both read the same scripture? Why should we as Muslims accept that?
Oh, I'm saying why I, as a Christian, reject Muhammad as a false prophet, and that would apply if you want me to apply what you would call Christian criteria, biblical criteria, being consistent as a Christian. Then I'm going to use the New Testament, which is what I quoted, which is rejected by religious Jews.
Would you not think that this is circular reasoning if you're just utilizing what you believe in?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it would only be if you are trying to say, King Servant, you're a Christian, you're critiquing us, you need to do it from within a Christian worldview. That's what it would look like. It would be open and closed case within 2 minutes. But I'm guessing you want to go further than that, which is why I did.
Yeah, no problem. When you mentioned chapter 6, verse 99, do you believe that this is in reference to Mecca?
As far as I'm aware, yes, it is. It's definitely a Meccan surah, and I think, yeah, I think it is. Although
I'm not asking whether it's a Meccan surah, I'm asking whether it refers to Mecca.
yeah, all the people who live around it, based on what I'm aware of, that is the case. But I know you're insisting otherwise, so I'd be open to see what you've got there.
Well, I'm not going to make a comment on what actually.
Yeah, I know you can now. Maybe in a statement.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you this: why is it that the majority of your evidence that you presented today was from inauthentic sources? Why did you do that?
Yeah, I don't agree that that was the case. I quoted from Sahih Hadith regarding Mary the Copt, and I quoted from the Quran for the bulk of my argument based on Alexander and Abraham. I do not accept the statement that the incident with Zainab and so forth is inauthentic. It comes from Tabari, sure, but I don't think that that makes it inauthentic by Sunni standards. I didn't see evidence presented that it was based on fabricated chains or anything of that nature. Yeah,
well, I'm not referring to the Quran because the Quran is, what's being tested. I'm talking about the historical material, right? And yes, this is why I said most of the evidence, not all the evidence. So, were you aware that these reports were inauthentic by Muslim standard?
Yeah, I was aware that the reports regarding the scribe would be classified that way. But I think it's something that a person considering if Muhammad was a true prophet or not ought to take into account that such narrations exist before assuming the Muslim classification of them by people who'd already accepted him as a true prophet.
A lot of assumption there. Okay. With regards to Abraham and the fire, what is your evidence that it was developed by Jews and not something that was it came from something that could have been true, yet became something that was within Jewish commentary? And that's my final question.
Oh, sure. Well, I referred to Yishai Kael's article on that, which in which he says the motif of Abraham's miraculous deliverance from a fire is completely absent from the Hebrew Bible, and it's developed from traces of this motif, which find their way in through Second Temple exegesis. So I demonstrated the wordplay, the association with Nimrod and Zoroaster, and so we can trace quite clearly where this story comes from and how it developed over time into what you have in the Quran.
Sure. I mean, I don't think that adequately
Okay,
answers the question, but that's fine.
Thank you for that, gentlemen. Hopefully, we're going to hand it over to King Servant. King Servant, your time will start as soon as you ask the first question.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So, can you name me, Al-Yemeni, one figure from pre-Islamic tradition who built a wall to keep out Gog and Magog, had two horns, and traveled from the Far East and the Far West, and was known as a righteous king, other than
Yeah,
Alexander?
sure. Yeah. Dhul Qarnayn.
Dhul Qarnayn means the two-horned one, right?
Yeah, you asked me for a figure. I gave you Dhul Qarnayn. You said other than Alexander the Great, I gave you Dhul
I
Qarnayn.
said in pre-Islamic literature.
Oh, pre-Islamic? No, there isn't one.
Okay. When it says in Surah 18, they ask you about Dhul Qarnayn, should that be understood that people are asking about a figure that they've heard of before and are making reference to?
Of course.
And is there any other figure that you have any reference to who that might be, who did these things that I described?
No, but the report you're referring to, they don't mention it was Alexander the Great either. They just mention the two-horned one. So I get this is a shifting of the burden of proof on your part.
So the two-horned one was used as a designation for who in pre-Islamic Arabia?
It wasn't limited to Alexander the Great. If you look at the early sources within around the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, there were other figures that were referred to as two-horned. So yeah.
Did any of those other figures build a wall to keep out Gog and Magog?
That's not the point. The point is that there were other. I know it's the question you're asking. I'm saying it's not a suitable question because it's not the point. The point is when you're referring to a two-horned one, it refers to several figures. That could be referred to several figures, but yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned, you're asking me the same question. I already said to you, no, there wasn't another figure that built a wall according to pre-Islamic literature.
Okay, so can you give me an actual reference to Mecca before the Quran? To Mecca, not to a temple in Arabia like Diodorus refers to, which is generally considered Nabatean, but to Mecca itself. Is that word ever used in pre-Quranic literature anywhere?
That's an exact word fallacy. You're asking for the exact name, especially when cities were known by different names. Even the Quran mentions that Mecca was known as Becca at one point, right? Now, Diodorus, my quote of Diodorus, I asked you the question which you didn't actually address previously, right? You're the one again shifting the burden of proof when it comes to Diodorus. So I think you should have addressed that.
Does Diodorus mention the term Mecca?
I already said to you, that's an exact word fallacy, right? Asking for that particular thing is not suitable. Right? I never claimed that. I said, name me another place that was revered, another temple, which is a place of worship, revered by the Arabs other than Mecca. That was the thing that you felt to provide.
I perhaps I'll do that in my closing statement. So are we to understand then, that what was Mecca trading in? What were the goods that they were trading? Patricia Kroner brings up the question. What would that have been?
Various things. They traded in silk, in spices, in rugs. This is all mentioned within our authentic historical sources, which you failed to disprove as unreliable methodology.
Doesn't Patricia Kroner directly address the trade in silk and in spices in her book Meccan Trade and the Rise of Early Islam, saying that this trade was no longer profitable in the 7th century?
Yeah, well, what's her sources for it? Because all you're doing at the moment is an appeal to authority. You're not actually providing the primary evidence which she uses to say that it's not profitable. There is no authentic tradition that says this was not no longer a profitable business. In fact, we do also know from the authentic historical sources, which you haven't used, that what was also profitable for them was the trade in gods. So this idea of paganism was something that was profitable to them as well.
Is it not the case that every single religious inscription from Arabia after the 5th century AD is exclusively monotheistic, according to Ahmad al-Jalad?
I haven't read all of his works. It was upon you to provide evidence of that, not just to simply claim it. So I can't comment on something you haven't provided evidence for.
Okay. Since I'd like to respond to that, but I can't, I'll respond as a question. Have you ever read his book, Ancient Allah, in which he does answer those things and provide the inscriptions?
No, that's not a book that I read of his. However, again, going back to our primary sources, see, I'm not appealing to authority here, Daniel, King Servant. I'm appealing to the authentic primary sources, which you haven't disproven yet.
And finally, what is your evidence that the forgotten chapters of the Quran mentioned at Basra were abrogated? Is that just what Muslim scholars say, or do you actually have narrations?
Oh, this is narrations of the abrogated. These are authentic narrations that are traceable and independently verified to establish that these were abrogated verses during the revelation itself. Because after the Quran, after the demise of the Prophet ﷺ, there wasn't nothing went missing from the Quran. Absolutely nothing. You would have to provide the evidence of that.
Is it not the case that, according to the narration supposedly by Aisha, that the verses of adult breastfeeding were being recited at the time of Muhammad's death when they were eaten by the sheep and gone missing?
I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, because this was a verse. These were verses that were abrogated close to his demise, and as we know, news doesn't travel as quick as it does today. So there was some people that were still reciting it due to the fact that the news has not yet reached them that it was abrogated.
Are there any narrations saying that these verses were abrogated?
Yeah, this is from Aisha radiallahu anha. She mentions it was abrogated explicitly.
And is it not the case that you still have abrogated verses in the Quran elsewhere?
Yeah, this is one of 3 forms of abrogation. They're not all the same type of abrogation. You should know that.
Mm-hmm. And where is it that these 3 forms of abrogation were developed? Was that developed by a Sahaba or by later scholars?
It's not a development. All 3 are recognized in the Quran. They are simply categorized as such in order to provide easy explanation. So in the same way as Tawheed and the 3 principles of Tawheed, it's not something mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ or the Sahaba. It wasn't categorized that way, but it was categorized by the scholars based on information from the primary sources, i.e. the Quran.
Where is it that the Quran recognizes the category of abrogation abrogation in recitation, but not in ruling?
Yeah, because we have the examples, so that's where it is. So, for example, the one of wine, that shows the abrogation of the ruling, but not the verse. When it comes to chapter 4, verse 15, it mentions in the report of Umar, where it comes to the abrogation of the rule, of the verse, but not the ruling, with regards to stoning, and the one that you brought as an example. So these are the 3 forms.
So, are Christians polytheists?
Yes.
Are you allowed to marry a polytheist?
With regards to a Christian, yes, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the people of the book, despite their shirk, a particular category, a particular position amongst mankind. and therefore we are allowed to marry their women and eat their meat, providing certain conditions are met.
Are you allowed to marry the women of polytheists according to the Quran?
No, not idolaters in the sense outside of the people of the book. No. How does? I'm sorry, I can't ask you a question. I wanted.
Yeah. So, do I have any time left? I don't know. It seemed like I got a 1 minute warning.
1 minute.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. So let's see now. Yeah. Do you have any of the Sahaba that you can name as rejecting the satanic verses?
All of them.
Can you provide?
In fact, I'll expand on my answer quickly, because even you mentioned that these reports go back to the Tabi'is. So if you are saying that they go back to the Tabi'is, asking me about the Sahaba doesn't actually make sense, because it didn't come from them.
Is it not the case that according to Dr. Yasser Qadhi, I know you love him, is it not the case that according to Dr. Yasser Qadhi, the best that anyone in academia will do is to admit that any hadith goes back to the Tabi?
Sorry, but appealing to Yasser Qadhi just goes to show your desperation and your questioning here. No, all right, it's not about what Yasser Qadhi thinks or anything. It's about what the primary evidence provides. And actually, no, it doesn't go back to the Tabi'is. If you actually look at the critical scholarship, they would say that it goes back to the companions, but they would not attribute it back to the Prophet, peace be upon him.
Okay, perfect ending. Appreciate that. Brothers and sisters, we're coming down to the last stages. We've got 5-minute conclusions from each speaker, and then it'll be a chance for the audience to ask questions. We'll be only taking written questions, but when you write a question, make sure who's it addressing to. Sometimes people write a question, and of course myself and the guests get confused in who's it actually aimed at and who's it for. So please, when you write a question, make sure you inform myself or the guest speakers it's actually aimed at them. So the next segment, brothers and sisters, is the 5-minute conclusion. Brother Yemeni, you did start, so of course you will begin your 5-minute conclusion, and I will step down, and then you can start your 5-minute conclusion.
Okay. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank King Servant for this debate. I know this is something we've planned for a while, and I'm glad that it's finally happened. I believe it was a good discourse, although I am disappointed in his approach. What I want to mention is that when it comes to this question, it is a historical question as well as a theological question. And unfortunately, my opponent today has not been able to provide any evidence that the isnad system in of itself is a poor methodology to utilize. So therefore, until something like that can be proven, when we cite our authentic reports, this is something that can remain unchallenged in terms of authenticity. Unfortunately, what my opponent did today is utilize the HCM, which is a very unreliable method, which assumes naturalistic proposition, which is, and in credit to him, he was consistent in utilizing that even for his scripture. But then I have to ask, why is he a Christian? As we have seen in the cross-examination, there were many admissions to an appeal, maybe not directly, but indirectly, an appeal to ignorance, not understanding certain things, even an admission to utilizing information that is known to be inauthentic, admission that the prophetic criteria is circular. So a very fallacious discussion from my opponent's part. However, to end on a very beneficial note, when it comes to evidencing the Prophet ﷺ, as I mentioned at the end of my opening statement, it is an impossible task when given to non-Muslims. And make no mistake, King Servant is a very intelligent man, which is why I agreed to debate him. But the strength of Islam, unfortunately, makes one who is quite intelligent seem very weak in his argumentation. But this is not, this is due to the strength of Islam, due to its historical and theological strength. And as we have covered indeed the historical methodology is very strong. The prophecies of Muhammad ﷺ could not be falsified. There was no evidence of internal contradictions of the Quran. There was nothing to actually debase the Prophet ﷺ with regards to his character. And there was no evidence of being able to produce a chapter like it, and all the other criteria that I have mentioned. So, and remember what I said during my opening statement, that what I have presented today is a mere fraction. What you guys need to understand is that my presentation has been chopped by 2/3 for this debate, and yet it was sufficient to conclusively prove that the Prophet ﷺ is a true prophet by virtue of my arguments and by virtue of the lack of argumentation and inability of my opponent. I have a lot of time left to spare regarding my closing statement, but there is not much more that I can say regarding this, because I think this debate has spoken for itself. I believe that the conclusion is self-evident, even for those who have a staunch stance against Islam, and due to the strength of my arguments and the impossible nature for my opponent to tackle them. So I'll leave it there, and I want to reiterate my thanks to King Servant, and I want to reiterate my thanks to all of you for coming for this debate. Inshallah, you have enjoyed it and benefited from it, be you Muslim or Christian. And with that being said, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Okay, Brother Yemeni, you ended a minute early, so thank you for that. I really appreciate that. It's amazing, we nearly got 300 people watching this debate. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Dialogue Wise channel. And if possible, share the stream to friends and families on your social media platforms. A very fascinating discussion so far. King Servant, of course, it's your opportunity now for your closing 5-minute response or statements, conclusion. I'll be stepping down, and as soon as I step down, your time will begin.
Thank you very much. So it's very nice for Al-Yemeni to give me the opportunity to preach the gospel in my closing statement. He asked me, so why are you a Christian then? Let's make the contrast. Imagine if the evidence for Jerusalem was similar to Mecca. Imagine if nobody in pre-Christian times had ever apparently heard of Jerusalem. The Romans never said anything about it. The Greeks never said anything about it. The Africans never said anything about it. The Jews themselves apparently never even heard of it. There was no inscriptions from Jerusalem anywhere. We don't have this problem. You can go to Jerusalem. You can see that it is there, with scholars unanimously saying, yes, this is the pavement that was built by Pilate with his inscription on it. This isn't a conspiracy. This is what is widely accepted. Even Bethlehem is better attested than Mecca. Nobody before the 8th century, except one reference in the Quran, ever mentions Mecca. Diodorus does not cut it. He's talking about somewhere in the north of Arabia, in the Nabatean district, which incidentally is where a lot of scholars think the Quran actually came from. Maybe it was even talking about Petra, who knows? The Bible is an intertextual book. Yeah, it refers to sources before, and it uses the quotations, it is written, when it's referring to scripture, and it leaves those quotations out if it's referring to the writing of a pagan poet or something. The Quran presents what is fiction created over time based on a historical figure, Alexander, and retrojected back the idea of Gog and Magog and him going to the rising place of the sun, to the setting place of the sun. This is just his perspective. No, the narrator of the story says that he went to this rising place of the sun. There is a rising place of the sun, and you can go to it according to the Quran. And he found it rising upon a people who needed shelter there, and so forth. Now, the same thing applies to Abraham and the fire. Prove to me, like, give me a narration saying that Muhammad got this story from a Jew who told it to him. Is this seriously where we've come to? Nobody does history this way. Nobody, except Muslims trying to defend Muhammad, does history this way. How do we know hadith are unreliable? You can go listen to Joshua Little for that if you want, or you can compare what they say to the external evidence. Everything that Al-Yemeni presented comes from within the Islamic tradition. If the Islamic tradition is false, or if it's not acceptable by historical standards, which it's not, nothing he said counts for anything. For example, Joshua Little writes on page 17 of his book, The Hadith of Aisha's Marital Age, that hadith are unreliable, that any given matan cannot be taken at face value as an accurate datum from the first Islamic century, and that any given isnad cannot be taken at face value as an accurate record of matan's provenance, cannot be seriously contested, for multiple reasons. What Yasir Qadi said was, nobody in the academy affirms the Muslim Sunni science of hadith. Nobody. It is considered to be completely discredited. I'm just being factual. End quote. Now, I could have attacked the character of Muhammad. I think every Muslim in the audience knows that I could have, and probably everybody else listening too. I could have talked about the people he murdered, the slavery, taking people's wives, having a 9-year-old child bride, which he got a vision of that was given to him by God, allegedly, again. But the question is, take a step outside. If you saw a community basing themselves around a figure that they were telling these kinds of stories about, all of them, which stories would you believe? Which stories would you think that were authentic if you saw a community basing themselves around a man with the same characteristics that we find from Muhammad? But we don't need to do that. It doesn't align with history. It doesn't align with reality. I'm grateful to Yemeni for correcting himself when he's made mistakes in the past publicly. A lot of people wouldn't do that. They'd just blag it. He doesn't tend to do that, and I appreciate that. But what I want him to do is I want him to recognize that the biggest mistake of all, the biggest error, is accepting Muhammad as a true prophet. And I would invite you to turn from him to the Lord Jesus Christ, the one who can save you from your sins. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that, King Servant, and I really appreciate you guys keeping this cordial discussion in this type of manner. It's been very beneficial for the audience. I'm just going to highlight some of the questions, but unfortunately, majority of the questions, of course, are aimed for King Servant. We've got to be fair, okay? So if there's any questions for Brother Yemeni, please write it in the chat. I've got about 7 questions so far for King Servant, and these are super chats. And of course, Brother Yemeni, you will have an opportunity also to respond to the question if you want to, or you can withhold. So are you happy to go along with the questions, King Servant?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to remind that we're going to have a maximum of 45 minutes. That's what we agreed to with regards to Q&A.
That's fantastic. But of course, depending on any questions for you, because we don't want to bombard King Servant with question after question. And
yes, we do.
I don't know about you, Yemeni, but that debate actually felt rather short to me. Like, I was expecting it would feel longer, but
no. Once you're in it, you could go for even longer. You know. So yeah, no, it was good.
Okay, we'll go straight to the questions. People are patiently waiting in the chat. Just a quick reminder, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Dawahwise. And of course, share this show, share the link to your family and friends on your social media platforms. Of course, Brother Yemeni's got a YouTube channel, and of course, you can contact King Servant via email, and hopefully we'll post that in the chat later on today. So we go straight to the first question. Unfortunately, surprise, surprise, is actually for King Servant. Okay, King Servant, there is a question, and if you want a minute, and then we can give the same minute to Brother Yemeni to respond.
Yeah, perfectly good question. I was paraphrasing. What it describes is that she was not wearing a great deal, and that she got up in haste, causing him to see more of her than perhaps was usual. And he exclaimed, "Blessed be Allah who causes hearts to turn." That's the way I remember it. So yeah, he saw her body when she got up hastily, and it says that he saw her. So I wouldn't classify that as hadith, though. This is tafsir literature.
Okay, that's 30 seconds. You want any more? Or are you good?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a great deal to say about that, except that Tabari isn't the only person who talks about this incident. There are different details given depending on where you look.
Okay, thank you. Brother Yemeni, you will have a minute to respond to that question.
Well, no, it's actually 30 seconds because it was directed to King Servant.
Make the last question in there. He had a really good question in the chat, if you haven't started already.
Brother Yemeni, do you want to address this? You can address this.
Yeah, I'll address it, inshallah. So yeah, I think again, you know, it was addressed in the debate that King Servant didn't even know that this was inauthentic. Any narration regarding the Prophet ﷺ lusting after her, not necessarily even seeing her body, but just generally lusting after her, is inauthentic. Just because it appears in our sources doesn't mean it's something to be relied upon. You need to be able to make the distinction between what is accepted and what isn't.
Okay, there's one question I'm just scanning through right now. Bear with me. It's a question for Brother Yemeni. Go ahead.
If Isnad methodology is impregnable, how did contradictory dates of Muhammad's time get through? Very good question, actually. I don't think you're referring to the contradictory dates of his time in Medina, rather in Mecca. So I'll correct you on that first. Secondly, it's based on, there is a reconciliation for this that is mentioned by the scholars. It's based on where it's calculated from, right? So there are three. One is that he was there for 10 years, another 13, and another that says 15. So there are three reports in Bukhari that mention this. The one that's 10 years mentions after the gap of, starts the timing from after the gap of revelation. So when there was a period without revelation. The second one in 13 is his total time from the point he received the revelation in the cave until he migrated. And the third one, which says 15, this actually refers to revelation period, because prior to the revelation of the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ did receive revelation in the form of dreams. So this was an approximation up to 15 years. So it's very easily reconcilable.
Thank you. King Servant, do you want to respond to that? You got 30 seconds.
I would just point out that the hadith are full of contradictions of various kinds. There was one, for example, whereby Robert Spencer frequently cites this. A man was killed during battle, and it says that Muhammad smiled and so forth. This detail is the same in each account, but the other details vary tremendously. Even the example of Mary the Copt, Yemeni cited an alternative rendering, also rated Sahih. They're both rated Sahih, saying that this was actually about Muhammad chewing honey instead, which his wives didn't like, and he promised not to do it again. So there's a lot of examples that can be given. For more research, look at Joshua Little's work.
Sure, thank you. We're going straight to the next question. Again, it's a super chat, so it's prioritized, and I'm going to bring it onto the screen now, and it's actually aimed at King Servant. The question is on the screen now.
Yeah. Where does Islamic tradition teach that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander? Great. I didn't get the chance to go into this in cross-examination, but can I share my screen? Because I do actually have a citation for this.
You have a minute if you can do that.
Yeah, it's Jalalain, actually. So I think it's slide 29 on here. Just a bit further. 35. There we go, Jalalain. So that's one example. There are other names in the tradition. But Jalalain is one of the ones who identify him as Alexander. I think the earliest ones are all Alexander, but Ibn Kathir would reject it, and you get other people that reject it on theological grounds, not on historical ones.
Okay, Brother Yemeni, you'll have 30 seconds to respond to that.
I mean, yeah, the response is on his screen, and they, the Jews, right? So this is an Israeliyah, right? And again, Al-Jalalain is not from the early centuries. So the people who received the Quran, who understood the Quran, they didn't believe this, right? So this in of itself is not an authentic report. It's just speaking about what Jews have said, right? We do not take Israeliyat as authentic or inauthentic, as commanded by the Prophet, peace be upon him. Do not believe nor disbelieve, right? But again, with regards to this, we know this is not who it's referring to, right? This was challenged to King Server, but he didn't produce evidence.
Okay, that's got on 30 seconds. A question for you now, Brother Yemeni.
What response do I have to Joshua Little? I think you're referring to his statement about the honey and the other narration, both of which are sahih. It's very simple. People were not quite sure which event was in reference to the revelation, which one was actually a reason for that revelation to descend. So while both events did occur, those who reported it were some believed it was due to one thing, and some believed it was due to another. Right. So, but through the examination of the scholars of these reports and the history and the chronology, and a lot of research has gone into it, most will say to you that this is regarding the honey, which is why I cited that opinion.
Yeah, so regarding Joshua Little, he's one of the best hadith skeptics out there and has done a lot of work on that. The comment about the honey and Mary, that came from me rather than from him, but he goes into great detail, giving 21 points why hadith cannot be trusted. No doubt traditional Sunni Muslims won't appreciate that very much, but if you want to look at it from a academic standpoint, he's the man to go to.
Okay, we're going to quick fire these questions because we've got loads already in the chat. So we're going to go quick fire. Again, King Servant, this question's for you. You'll have a minute to respond and 30 seconds to Brother Yemeni.
Yeah, so there is actually a pre-Islamic collection of poems. I don't recall the name of it, but you can look at the work of Dr. Shady Nasser. He has a lecture called "Is the Quran Bad Poetry?" in which he goes in detail in comparison between the Quran and pre-Islamic poetry, and it's as a poetry collection, so it's pretty clear what is classed as poetry. Does the definition apply to the Quran? Yes, it does. The Quran is poetry, but it is true that it breaks the rules of his Arabic poetry and so forth. It doesn't break the rules because it's better than it. It breaks the rules because it's not good at what it's trying to do. So, yeah, I think that answers the question. You have poetry collections, and things are recognized in Islamic tradition as pre-Islamic poetry, but I don't take Islamic
tradition. That's 1 minute. Can we just slow this down? Because what's happening is that you're having a minute to respond, 30 seconds to just have a little 5-second break before I reset the timer, because otherwise I'm going to get lost in the timing. So, Brother Yemeni, you've got 30 seconds to respond starting now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was hoping you'd bring this up because you even made a TikTok about this. And it's very interesting because what he mentions is that the Quran is not poetry. He said if it was poetry, it would be considered bad poetry, but it is not poetry. Listen to the quote, right? You actually put it on your own TikTok, and it doesn't say that it is bad poetry. He says if this was how it would have happened, in the same way that with my quote of Al-Baqalini, which is a primary source, what you're doing, King Servant, is still an appeal to authority. You're not actually explaining the primary sources that they utilize for this information. Al-Baqalini says the same thing. If you said such and such, then it would be bad at it, but it is not it. You need to contextualize these things.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got a question. I'm assuming it's actually for Brother Yemeni. It isn't actually, it is a super chat, so I'm assuming it is for Brother Yemeni. Can you see the question?
Yeah, what criteria determines authentic hadith? This wasn't mentioned in my first slide. So generally speaking, it's named chains of transmissions, right? So we have to know who is in the chain. It evaluates the men in the chain with regards to their memory, their honesty, their location, their lineage, and so on and so forth. We have a lot of information about these men. It checks continuity, right? So we established that these people met those who came before them. Now, this is a criteria of Bukhari, which is more rigorous than those who preceded him. But the reason he was able to do this is because that information was preserved anyway. It has to cross-check. There's cross-checking of these reports. So if there are multiple reports of the same thing, it all gets cross-checked to look for defects. And they are graded due to what we have mentioned. And it has clear falsification, which means any defect would be noticed. In fact, there's something called al-ilal. Ilal in hadith means hidden defect. This is to the extent that we look for defects in order to ensure it is authentic.
Thank you.
But that's in a nutshell.
Okay, 30 seconds. King Servant, do you want to respond to this question?
Yeah, I would like to actually. Most of what Yemeni said is, an accurate representation of the way it's done. That's perfectly fine. But the fact that needs to be taken into account is that your character can be called into question if you have the wrong theology. For example, if you are a Mutazilite who is narrating, because of your theology, you will be treated with greater skepticism than someone else. If you have some tendencies towards Shiism, you won't be trusted. There is a lot of circularity that goes in here as well. And that's why Shia and Sunni have different hadith, because they trust different people.
Okay.
These things need to be taken into account.
Okay, thank you for that.
I hate that I can't respond to that.
Okay, we're going to go to the next question. Brothers and sisters, the questions are coming in fast and rapid, and I really appreciate it. We got so many super chats and super stickers. Dawah-wise really appreciates that, appreciates your support. Next question is from our brother, Dawah Trucker. Welcome, brother. Appreciate your donation, contribution. Go ahead, Daniel. I think this is, sorry, King Servant, this is aimed at you.
We do have evidence for the existence of Jerusalem prior to the Israelites entering the land. Pre-Jewish, if you like, Canaan is very well attested. We have things from Jebus, as Jerusalem was known as at the time. And yeah, you can look that up very easily and find archaeological evidence of Jebus, as it was known at the time of the conquering of Canaan. And this is normal. This is to be expected. Why don't they have it for Mecca? There is a serious problem going on here. There are inscriptions, like the rock inscriptions that Ahmed al-Jalad looks at, but none of them are in Mecca. There aren't any in Mecca. Mecca is, I'm not insisting that it never existed, by the way. What I'm insisting is it certainly never existed in the way that Islamic tradition portrays it. And that is actually the mainstream view. The mainstream view is that Mecca existed, but not in the way that is portrayed by the Islamic tradition. Personally, I doubt its existence, but I'm not necessarily insisting on that for this debate.
Sure, thank you. Brother Yemeni, I'm going to reset the time. You've got 30 seconds to respond to that.
Yeah, very simple. I mean, he asked for the evidence of Jerusalem, not the other place that you mentioned, right? Isn't that what you did regarding Mecca, asking for that specific name? It's, what's it called? What you refer to as Jalub or something like that? I mean, be consistent. Yeah, I can't remember what you said, but you got to be consistent, because that's the same question you asked me, right? Now, again, like I said to you, Jerusalem, the things that have been dug up, it's because they were under the earth to be dug up. These were not places that were constantly renovated like Mecca. So it's, again, category error. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, I know it's difficult. Yeah, I know it's difficult, but I'm sure there will be a follow-on to this discussion. So, brothers and sisters, stay tuned for that. Okay, we're going straight to the next question. And like I said, these questions are coming in like hot cake. So I want to really dish them out and serve them as quickly as I can. This question is for Brother Yemeni. Brother Yemeni, I don't know if you can see the question.
Yeah. So as a Muslim, do you think we have to have written something pointing Mecca for Mecca to be Mecca? If yes or no, why? I actually did demonstrate. First and foremost, it's not the question of whether I'm a Muslim or not. This is supposed to be an objective discussion, right? So it's not about whether from the Muslim perspective, because even when I spoke about the Isnad system, it's not because it's a Muslim system, it's because it's a historical methodology, right? It just so happens to lie with the Muslims, right? This is why it's so authentic. But again, when it talks about history, I mentioned Diodorus of Sicily, right, which King Sullivan still hasn't responded to in a conclusive way. Just assuming it's Petra, right? Because some 80s Orientalists have said so. In fact, even in Exodus chapter 5, verse 1, if you look at Hebrew lexicons, when they mention the word Hajj in Hebrew, they actually put it in as Hajj, as pilgrimage to Mecca in their own lexicons. This is what the Jews say, right? And this is mentioned in Exodus. So you got to look at the evidence regarding this. Okay, so
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, Brother Yemeni, thank you for that. I know you want to continue, and I can see King Servant also biting his tongue. But of course, time is at a premium here, so we've got to go through the questions as quickly as possible. King Servant, you have 30 seconds to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you. So, what does Diodorus actually say? Does he mention Mecca? No. He just says that there's a center for cultic worship in Arabia. You've got the whole of Arabia. He says there's a center of cultic worship there, a temple. And so that's the best Yemeni's got for evidence of pre-Islamic Mecca. There were centers of worship and temples all over Arabia in different places. They existed in Petra too. I'm not insisting it was Petra he was talking about. It could well have been. Jebus is mentioned in the Bible, by the way, the Jebusites. It's not
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's 41 seconds. I did give you some extra time.
Yeah, that's fine, sure.
Because I know you were biting your tongue earlier, so I thought I'd give you
assumptions here.
Okay. We're going straight to the next question. I thank you for the donation, the super chat. Here we go. This one's for King Servant. Go ahead, King Servant.
Yeah, I don't think that's an appropriate question.
Yeah, that's not. I mean, that is setting him up to fail, really. I know that's the intent.
King Servant. I mean, Brother Yemeni. If King Servant wants to pass on this, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to respond to it.
No, it's not fair for me to mention the difference between قد قربت وقربت. You know, because it's a question to him. I shouldn't answer it.
Okay, we'll go to King Servant. If you're happy to go to the next question, it's aimed towards you, so you can read it and deal with it. Thank you.
Yeah, what medical paper could I cite that disproves the morphological traits of the offspring are determined in that way? Basically, anything that you read on genetics and on why certain traits are inherited and how that is determined has nothing to do with that whatsoever. And bear in mind that the context for this is these are supposedly 3 questions that Muhammad was asked so that a prophet only would know how to answer them. The person asking the question wouldn't know. So it's not a good reason to accept Muhammad as a prophet. We have all more reason to reject it now, but even under his conditions, he wouldn't know if Muhammad was making stuff up off the top of his head or whatever else. There's no reason he should accept Muhammad as a prophet based on something like this.
Yeah, this is an argument from silence. You know, at the end of the day, look, there is no, you know, because there's nothing there, you're assuming that this is false. You know, there's actually no studies that could be cited to prove that this particular aspect of the traits of offspring can be falsified. And of course, with Abdullah bin Salam, he wouldn't ask him these questions if he already knew what the answers were from previous prophetic traditions that he had access to. Otherwise, there's no point of him giving him the test. Doesn't make sense.
Okay, thank you for that. On 30 seconds. Let me reset the clock. We've got another super chat. I really appreciate the super chats, brothers and sisters. This question's for Brother Yemeni. It's on the screen. It's a lengthy one, and I'm hoping you can deal with it within a
Yeah,
minute.
Waraqah said the angel in Hira was the Namus, not Gabriel. The Namus was the angel of Lord. It appeared to Moses. Gabriel never appeared to Moses. Islam is based on a misidentification. No, because the Namus is not a name; it is a title, right? The Namus refers to the one who the keeper of the secrets. Okay, this is how Waraqah identified him. This is what is meant by Namus. So not Gabriel. He didn't identify him by his name. He identified him by a title based on a scripture that he had, right? Not based on what you have. You got to get that right. So the misidentification comes from you, not from Waraqah.
Okay, interesting. Let me just reset my time. I really appreciate you guys waiting. That was well under a minute, but you got 30 seconds to respond, King Servant.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I point out that in Yemeni's discussion with Paperboy on Was Muhammad Deceived, he actually said that Waraqah was a Christian who used the writings of Paul. He seems to have significantly changed his position on the scriptures that Waraqah had since then. But the main mistake I think that Christians make is in taking the Islamic sources far more seriously than skeptical scholars do. You don't have to insist that Muhammad is a completely made-up figure to recognize that most scholars think that this incident never took place at all. We don't need an alternative explanation for it.
Okay, thank you for that. There's so many questions, and I'm really surprised that there is a mixed bag of questions for everybody here. Just patiently going through them now. Let me just. The thing is, I want to stay on topic, so I don't want to. Okay.
By the way, I keep hearing notifications. Has someone got their notifications open?
Let me just check.
I'm afraid that's probably my fault, to be honest. I think.
Oh, okay. Because what happened, I think, during your closing statement, it did buzz a couple of times, and it sort of drowned out your voice momentarily each time. So fortunately, it still came through clear enough, but yeah, it did do that.
Just looking, there's a question in
Yeah,
the chat.
Now, but we'll see.
I'm looking for a question. It's a two-part question, and it's pretty interesting. So I'm just gonna. It's from KS, and I'm trying to find it where it was. I do apologize.
So inshallah, after the questions are answered, you can unstar them.
Yeah, I think that's a good way. Unmute.
Yeah, instead of just going through them and keeping them, you can unstar them once it's been addressed.
Okay, that question was for Yemeni, and now hopefully we'll get a question for King Servant. Okay, I'm hoping this hasn't been repeated prior, but can you see the question?
Yeah. The character differences and characteristics. Okay. Let me know when to start. Okay, so the differences in characteristics and criteria are that HCM, as you call it, the historical critical method, goes, instead of depending on long lines or shorter lines of transmission, it goes for the earliest evidence available, the most widely attested evidence available. So multiple reports of the same thing as early as you can get it, and especially if it's material that is less likely to be made up. So these are the characteristics that indicate something that is historically true. And you can see how there would be applied, for example, to the Satanic Verses. Multiple reports. It's earlier than most Hadith collections and seems to be filtered out over time. Would a Muslim make this up? Not really. Would a non-Muslim make this up? Perhaps. But how would they get so many Muslims to transmit it if they did? These are the kinds of characteristics that indicate a greater level of historical authenticity.
Okay.
Lines of transmission from people who are deemed reliable by people within the same tradition is, very questionable, because you're only accepting things from people that you like and people who believe the same things and teach the same things that you approve of.
Okay, thank you.
You need to look outside of the tradition for a wider historical view.
Okay. Do you want to
Yeah,
respond to that? Right.
yeah. I mean, like I mentioned before, the HCM is based on methodological naturalism. I don't know why he's using it as the standard, because if you were to use it consistently, you would have to say that Jesus is not a prophet, he's not a messenger, he's not God, because the HCM doesn't actually care about this stuff. And it begs the question, it assumes its conclusion that it's not revelatory, right? So it's a poor system. That's the main problem with it. And yes, he's right about going back to the earlier sources, but you can't, that's as far as it goes. It's early, therefore it must be true, right? But no one actually argues it must be true. They say most likely, it's probabilistic, whereas the Isnad system is certain. There's no ambiguity regarding it.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, let me reset, and hopefully this question is not a repeat question. This one's for Brother Yemeni.
No, it's not a
Okay,
repeat question. I was waiting for this. Can you address King's point on the Persian loan words in the Quran, given the reports in the Hadith that the Quran was revealed in the Qurayshi dialect? Beautiful question. I actually love the questions coming from this individual. I invite you to my stream so we can have discussions. What do you call it? It's no secret that the Quran has foreign words in it, okay, that come from foreign roots. Now, as Al-Suyuti mentions, that they are Arabic words, but when we refer to Arabized, right, so to make it clear, these are Arabic words, so they originate in the Arabic language, but where they're getting the information from and the names and stuff, this is Arabized in the sense that it comes from a different language, right? But in of itself, in the Quran, it's Arabic language, so it has its own roots and whatnot, and it's not limited to Persian, right? It's not limited to Persian. So it's a brilliant question. Hopefully that answers it.
okay, let me reset. King 7, you got 30 seconds to respond to that.
So the issue that I brought up with this is that it suggests a source that's more northern than Mecca. We can compare it with other Arabic writings, and we see that the number of Persian loanwords goes up as you move up in the Arabian Peninsula. Would make sense as you get closer to Persia. It's similarly curious that all of the major Hadith collectors are living far north of Mecca. Bukhara, for example, everything is based around the north, and that would fit perfectly with the content of the Quran itself, including the agricultural
Sure. Okay.
comments.
Thank you for that. I did give you some extra time to wrap that up. We've got a two-part question. This is for you, King Servant. So I just want you to read it carefully because it all didn't fit in the one particular part here. So let me know when you've read the first part, so I can show you the second part to the question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I got that first part. Okay. Yeah. So
what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a minute and a half to respond to this question because it is a lengthy question. And if that's okay, I can give a minute to Yemeni to also respond to it because it is a lengthy question. If that's okay with both of you.
Yeah, sure. That's perfectly reasonable. I don't feel like I need that long, but I'll certainly be willing for that to be the case. So basically, yeah, it's obviously very true that there are significant parallels between the Code of Hanabari and the Mosaic Law. That is well recognized. I don't think that the parallels are sufficient to prove derivation, unlike what we have with the Alexander legends. bear in mind, we're talking about very unique characteristics with Alexander. You not only have the two horns, you've got Gog and Magog being named specifically, the building of the wall between them, and them being released at the Day of Judgment. Yes, there is definitely similarities between Hammurabi and the Mosaic Law Code, but there are also significant differences, which suggest that they're not actually being presented with the same events in the same order as we see with the Alexander romances. And yeah, there are significant differences in content as well. For example, if a man builds a house and it falls down on the man who bought it, then the builder should be killed. Okay. But it also has, if his family are in it, then the family of the builder should be killed. And this is something that's prohibited by the Mosaic Law Code. So there are significant differences. There are not such significant differences between the Alexander romances and the Quranic material.
Okay, thank.
Yeah, what his response should have been is, yes, you are right, to be consistent, because it's similar, or in this case, the exact same thing. Therefore, it is borrowing of earlier material, not, as opposed to revelation. That's what you should have said, because that's what you implied on the Quran, right? And if you want to talk about significant difference, yeah, Dhul Qarnayn was a Muslim, Alexander was a pagan. That's a significant difference.
Okay, due to the lack of time, we're going to have one more question each, and then hopefully we'll come to a beautiful conclusion for today. It's been a very fascinating discussion, and I hope everybody's enjoyed it so far. Let me just go to another question. I don't know if it's going to be slightly off topic, but here we are. Brother Yemeni, if you want to address it, you can.
How was your debate with a naturalist today who debunked the Bible and Christianity with his approach? It went very well. It went very well, I believe. But at the end of the day, it's not down to me what I think. It's down to the people and what they think regarding the evidence that was presented by each side. But of course, I believe I've done right. I've done good in this debate, and I'm pretty sure King Servant will say that he's done all right in his efforts as well. Unless you want to admit I did good.
No.
Okay, King Servant, you'll have 30 seconds to respond.
I think you used it.
I don't think there's not much to say. If there's anything you want to share, feel free to say something.
Yeah, just briefly. I want to point out that the Hammurabi Code does not parallel it as closely as the questioner was implying. You can check that out for yourself. But what I would actually like you to observe is that Christians don't actually have a problem with sources for the Bible. We even think that in the book of Daniel, Daniel is deliberately taking things off pagan polytheists and using them as a polemic against them. You don't have the same luxury as a Muslim. You end up trying to justify things which were made up for this purpose. You don't get the same thing in the Bible that would parallel Abraham and the fire, for example.
Okay. I'm assuming we started with you first with the first question, wasn't it, King Servant? Yeah. So we're gonna. Okay. So this one's going to be for yourself, and then the last question will be for Brother Yemeni.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
this is the same question again.
It's the same question. It is the same question.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Preservation of the Bible and chains back to Jesus. I could answer that.
But that wasn't highlighted because it's not relevant to the subject.
Let me go to this one here. I think this is a new question.
Yeah, that would be to you. That would be to you.
I presume it is. Yeah, I take it that he's referring to the fact that Tabari says that he includes material which isn't necessarily considered authentic by him. But his opinion isn't binding on myself or Yemeni. And I'm not even pretending that even what I quoted that was Sahih is actually authentic. I'm saying that if you looked at Islam as an outsider and you saw that there were these stories floating around the prophet-like figure that this community followed, even including the stories that Yemeni mentioned, and you looked at it as a whole, you wouldn't want to follow this man if you actually took into account all of the evidence. You would think, I don't think they'd make up that. They probably would make up that. And I think that you would have good reason to not accept him as a prophet. But I'm going further than that and arguing historically that
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Hold on there, brother Yemeni. I know
we know where the Quran comes from, and it's not from God.
Okay.
It's obviously from
You
elsewhere.
have 30 seconds now to respond, brother Yemeni. Go ahead.
yeah, like I said, I'm sorry because you've hidden behind assumption this whole debate. You're putting forward these things. I'm not saying this may be this. Yes, it's assuming this because it's early. You've been hiding behind assumptions this whole time. The reality is you haven't disproven that these Sahih Hadith are not authentic. You haven't disproven that. So saying, I'm not saying that it's authentic. I'm assuming it might, if there is a question here to be had, you don't even provide any evidence for it to be a question. So I'm sorry. Yeah, but at least At-Tabari mentions very clearly, I know what is authentic, I know what is inauthentic, and I'm telling you, I'm making them, there's a mix of both.
Okay, Yemeni, thank you for that. Okay, this is going to be the final question. And let me actually thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate it. This is a question for Brother Yemeni. You'll have a minute to respond and 30 seconds to King 7.
Muhammad and wife. Which wife? Oh, Khadija was very doubtful about the nature of the angel in Hira. In the Bible, no angel forced a human except the human wrestling. Jacob, how can you believe in Muhammad ﷺ if he doubted? No, they didn't doubt in the nature of Gabriel. In fact, Khadija said, Allah will not do this to you. Right? So she actually put certainty into the heart of the Messenger ﷺ. And the Messenger ﷺ, at the end of the day, this is a natural human reaction. This is a man who had an encounter with someone he didn't know, who squeezed him tightly and commanded him to recite something. This is a traumatic experience, a place of uncertainty. He didn't know what was going on, so he sought comfort, and his wife said with a surety, Allah will not do this to you. He will not, humiliate you like this. And then she went to her cousin, knowing that he would affirm. Right? So there was no doubt regarding this. And the Prophet ﷺ soon after had his own certainty when the revelation continued to come.
Yeah, if we can get my presentation up, I do actually have something relevant to the question. Thank you. So slide 55. So I know it's a little small to read, but according to the earliest source, Ibn Ishaq, what actually convinced Muhammad that he was a prophet and Gabriel appeared to him, again, I don't accept this as historical. I don't accept anything in Muhammad's life outside the Quran as historical. But if you want to hold Muslims to the earliest sources they have, she sits on him and strips and asks him, do you still see Gabriel now? And when eventually he says no, she says, oh, it's clearly an angel.
45 seconds.
It's bizarre, but yeah, there you go.
Okay, thank you for that. That actually concludes today's debate. What a fascinating, interesting debate, brothers and sisters. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the super chats and super stickers. And if you haven't subscribed, if you're new to Dawah Wise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And of course, Brother Yemeni has got a YouTube channel, and myself, I've got a very fledgling YouTube channel, and I'm sure King Servant has also. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to their YouTube channels respectfully. Thank you for the Q&A. It's been very fascinating. It's very fast-paced. I don't think there's going to be any closing remarks from each speaker. Do you want to say a minute each before we wrap it up, out of respect each?
Yeah, I just want to, thank Daniel again for the debate. It was interesting, and I think he's done a fantastic job in strengthening the arguments for Islam. But I also want to mention that we will be doing a post-debate analysis at in 20 minutes after this, inshallah, while everything is still fresh in their mind. So if you are a Muslim or a Christian and you want to hear the thoughts of people of this debate and maybe exchange ideas and whatnot, you're more than welcome to hop over to my channel and do and have that after party, essentially.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Yemeni encourages non-Muslims to take part and ask the questions. If you missed out on today's Q&A, feel free to go onto the channel and ask questions directly to Brother Yemeni. I'm sure he'll be happy and graceful enough to respond to your questions. Go ahead.
I also have one more thing. My apologies. As I mentioned, that I did cut out a lot of information with regards to this. There will be a stream, later on, inshallah, on my channel where we will have the full presentation as it was originally intended, and I invite Christians to come on and challenge it without time restriction. Of course, this is a debate. We have time restrictions on both our parts, so that's an invitation to Christians to challenge my full presentation. Which has a lot more detail and will clear up many things, inshallah.
Okay, King 7, I'm actually going to give you a minute and a half because the only did take a minute and a half. So out of respect, you'll have a minute and a half to deal with any closing statements. Go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you to yourself, Mohammed, for, well, I should be more specific. Thank you to yourself, Abu Shuaib, for moderating for us. And thank you for, after about 2.5 years after you originally challenged me to debate this topic, for setting a time and date for it, Yemeni. And I'm glad that we've been able to have the debate, and I think our friendship is as intact as when we started. So I'm grateful for that. And yeah, obviously a lot of things didn't get said on both sides. There's only so much time, and yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to share with you what I have to say on the subject. Thank you.
I've got to say, gentlemen, this is one of the times or a show or a debate where I just don't want it to end. It was very interesting, very beneficial for all the audience, and the questions were fascinating. And I do apologize if I never got to deal with all the questions. But like I said, you'll have opportunity in a couple of minutes to jump on Brother Yemeni's channel to ask him directly. So I'd like to say thank you, Brother Yemeni, for letting me host this show and participate in today's discussion debate. King 7, again, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for calling out and asking my help, and I'm always at everybody's help or service if they need a host. I do try my best. Thank you so much for joining us, brothers and sisters. This is Brother Muhammad from CovFF YouTube channel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.